In the laboratories of the Third Reich, behind locked doors and sterile white walls, some of the most grotesque chapters of human history unfolded. What should have been the pursuit of healing and discovery became a weapon of ideology and control. Doctors who once swore an oath to preserve life instead became agents of death, presiding over experiments that treated human beings as disposable subjects. Freezing baths, pressure chambers, poison injections, and forced infections, all carried out in the name of science, but designed for war and racial obsession. This is the story of Nazi human experiments during the Second World War, a chilling reminder of what happens when ideology corrupts medicine, when ethics vanish, and when human life is stripped of value. We will uncover the policies that paved the way, the men who carried them out, the victims who endured unimaginable suffering, and the post-war trials that brought the truth to light. It is not only a journey into the darkest corridors of science, but also a reflection on how fragile civilization becomes when knowledge is misused. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for a detailed exploration of this grim history. As always, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Drop it in the comments before we begin this deep dive into the shadows of wartime medicine. To understand the horrors of Nazi human experimentation, one must first return to the intellectual soil from which it grew. Long before the first scalpel cut into the flesh of a prisoner, the groundwork had been laid in ideas of racial purity and biological destiny. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Germany, like much of Europe, was captivated by pseudo-scientific theories of eugenics. Eugenics argued that humanity could be improved by controlling reproduction, eliminating the unfit, and encouraging the superior. These concepts, dressed in the language of science, carried immense appeal to policymakers eager to shape society. In Germany, scarred by defeat in World War I and burdened with economic despair, such ideas found fertile ground. National humiliation, combined with fears of decline, made promises of biological renewal all the more seductive. The rise of the Nazi Party transformed these once fringe concepts into state doctrine. What had begun as speculative theories became the bedrock of a regime determined to shape humanity itself. Medicine, once a healing profession, would soon become an instrument of destruction. Adolf Hitler himself was deeply influenced by ideas of racial struggle and social Darwinism. In Mein Kampf, he wrote of races locked in eternal competition, with the strongest destined to dominate, and the weak doomed to perish. He borrowed the language of biology to describe politics, insisting that nations lived or died by the purity of their blood. This rhetoric resonated with a public already familiar with eugenic discourse, but under Nazism it was radicalized into absolute law. The Jewish people in particular were cast as parasites undermining the health of the German Volk. Roma, the disabled, homosexuals, and other marginalized groups were likewise condemned as threats to racial vitality. By the time the Nazis seized power in 1933, the ideological framework was in place. Society itself was to be treated as a living organism, cleansed of disease and impurity. Doctors, scientists, and public health officials were invited to act as its surgeons. This was not metaphor to the regime. It was policy. The path to the laboratories of Auschwitz began with the pages of Mein Kampf. The medical profession, far from resisting, became one of the earliest groups to embrace Nazi ideology. Nearly half of German physicians joined the Nazi Party, or its affiliated organizations, a higher proportion than in any other profession. Many did so not out of fear, but conviction, seeing in Nazism a chance to elevate medicine to the highest level of national importance. Doctors were promised prestige, resources, and power if they aligned their work with the goals of the Reich. The Hippocratic Oath, once the guiding principle of healing, was quietly replaced with a new loyalty to the health of the nation, not the individual. Medical journals filled with articles on hereditary diseases, racial purity, and the dangers of degeneracy. Universities taught courses in racial hygiene, where future doctors learned to view patients not as individuals, but as representatives of genetic stock. Clinics began sterilizing those deemed unfit to reproduce, often without consent, in the name of public health. This was medicine stripped of ethics, repurposed into a weapon of ideology. The transformation was swift, chilling, and profound. Central to this transformation was the concept of racial hygiene, a pseudo-scientific discipline that claimed to safeguard the purity of the German people. Developed before Hitler's rise, racial hygiene argued that the survival of a nation depended on eliminating hereditary weakness and promoting biological strength. Under the Nazis, this concept took on a new urgency and brutality. Laws passed in 1933 mandated the compulsory sterilization of those with conditions such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary blindness, and even alcoholism. Courts established panels of doctors who decided, often within minutes, whether a patient would lose the right to reproduce. By the end of the decade, hundreds of thousands had been sterilized in Germany under these laws. These measures were justified as scientific, rational, and progressive, cloaked in the authority of modern medicine. In truth, they were acts of state violence disguised as public health. The cold logic of racial hygiene laid the foundation for even darker experiments to come. It was the first step on a road that would lead to the camps. The idea that human life could be graded, measured, and discarded became normalized in German society. Posters depicted healthy, blonde families as the ideal, while caricatures portrayed Jews and the disabled as drains on national vitality. Propaganda films like Erbkrank, Hereditary Illness, presented the disabled as burdens consuming resources needed for soldiers and workers. Children in schools were taught to calculate how much it cost the state to care for the mentally ill, subtly teaching them to see life in terms of utility. The message was clear: some lives were worth more than others, and some were worth nothing at all. Medical authority gave these ideas legitimacy, as doctors endorsed them with charts, lectures, and clinical diagnoses. Patients trusted their physicians, never suspecting that behind the white coat lay allegiance to ideology. This erosion of moral boundaries was deliberate, step by step desensitizing the public to cruelty. By redefining who was human enough, the Nazis prepared the ground for atrocities. Science had been hijacked and compassion silenced. Eugenics was not unique to Germany, but under the Nazis it reached its most radical and violent expression. In the United States, Britain, and Scandinavia, sterilization laws had already been passed in the early 20th century. German scientists drew heavily on these precedents, citing American eugenics programs in their justifications. What distinguished Nazi Germany was the marriage of these ideas to totalitarian power and genocidal intent. The state had absolute authority, and the apparatus of terror ensured no resistance. With doctors willing to comply, eugenics expanded from sterilization into euthanasia. The lives unworthy of life doctrine declared that the disabled, the mentally ill, and others deemed unproductive should be killed. Medical institutions became sites of quiet mass murder, disguised as treatment. Techniques of killing perfected here, gas chambers, lethal injections, starvation, were later transplanted into the death camps. The line between medicine and murder had vanished. What remained was a system in which science no longer healed, but destroyed. The corruption of medicine into an instrument of the state represented one of the most profound betrayals in modern history. Doctors, once sworn to protect life, became engineers of death. Universities, instead of fostering inquiry, produced research that justified cruelty and exclusion. Laboratories no longer sought cures, but tested poisons, sterilizations, and mutilations on the most vulnerable. Bureaucracy gave these crimes a veneer of legitimacy, with forms, signatures, and diagnoses masking acts of violence. Each step, from sterilization to euthanasia to experimentation, was presented as rational and necessary. In reality, it was the systematic abandonment of medical ethics in favor of ideology. The language of science provided cover for acts that were anything but scientific. Behind every statistic stood a life destroyed, a family shattered, a future stolen. This betrayal of medicine was not accidental. It was intentional. It was the perversion of knowledge into power, and power into atrocity. By the time the war began in 1939, the foundations of Nazi science were firmly in place. Doctors had been trained to think in terms of racial hygiene, not patient care. Society had been taught to view life through the cold lens of utility. The disabled, the mentally ill, the Roma, and the Jews had already been marked as expendable. Laboratories and hospitals were prepared to serve the state, not the sick. The stage was set for the transformation of concentration camps into laboratories of horror. What began as sterilizations and euthanasia would evolve into experiments with freezing, poisons, infections, and surgeries. The tools of healing had been fully repurposed into tools of cruelty. The next chapters of this story are not about mistakes or misjudgments, but about deliberate, calculated crimes. Science had been stripped of conscience, and medicine had been chained to ideology. The nightmare of Nazi human experiments was about to begin. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, one of the professions most eager to align itself with the new regime was medicine. Physicians were not merely bystanders in the Nazi project, they were among its most enthusiastic participants. Nearly half of all German doctors joined the Nazi Party or its affiliated organizations, such as the SA and SS, a far higher percentage than most other professions. Many were motivated not by fear, but by ambition, seizing the chance to secure funding, prestige, and influence under the new government. The Nazi vision elevated medicine to a central role in shaping the future of the Volk, transforming doctors into engineers of the national body. Health was no longer defined by the individual, but by the racial community, and physicians became guardians of this collective purity. Hospitals and clinics quickly adjusted their practices, aligning patient care with ideology. Those labeled as hereditarily ill were sterilized, institutionalized, or marked for euthanasia. Doctors issued diagnoses that became death sentences, often with a stroke of a pen. The corruption of German medicine was swift, systemic, and devastating. Universities, once bastions of scientific inquiry, also fell rapidly into line with Nazi ideology. Medical faculties purged Jewish professors, researchers, and students, stripping German science of some of its brightest minds. Those who remained filled the void by embracing racial hygiene and hereditary biology as central fields of study. Courses on race science became compulsory, training the next generation of doctors to think in terms of genetic value rather than patient well-being. Students dissected case studies not to understand disease, but to identify traits of degeneracy and fitness. Laboratories once devoted to healing now conducted research on sterilization methods, hereditary illnesses, and population control. Scholars published articles extolling the necessity of eliminating the weak for the health of the nation. Far from resisting, universities competed for state support by proving their usefulness to the regime's racial goals. Scientific rigor was replaced with political loyalty, and evidence was twisted to serve ideology. The intellectual foundation of German medicine was dismantled from within, replaced with propaganda cloaked as scholarship. The German Medical Association, the professional body meant to safeguard standards of care, became a willing accomplice in this transformation. Its leaders pledged loyalty to Hitler, declaring medicine inseparable from the destiny of the Reich. Ethical standards that had guided doctors for centuries were rewritten to align with Nazi priorities. Instead of do no harm, the guiding principle became serve the Volk. Physicians were urged to think of themselves as soldiers in a biological war, fighting to preserve the health of the nation by eliminating threats within. Professional journals reinforced this message, praising sterilization laws and publishing research that demonized Jews, Roma, and the disabled. Dissenting voices were silenced through dismissal, intimidation, or worse. The association became not a shield for medical ethics, but a sword wielded against the vulnerable. Its embrace of Nazi ideology gave legitimacy to crimes disguised as treatment. Medicine's governing institutions, rather than resisting, actively encouraged betrayal of their own oaths. The profession's complicity was total. Propaganda played a crucial role in shaping public perception of medicine's new purpose. Posters adorned clinic walls, showing healthy Aryan families contrasted with caricatures of the disabled and diseased. Films produced under Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda portrayed euthanasia as mercy and sterilization as progress. One infamous film, Erbkrank, Hereditary Illness, depicted institutionalized patients as hopeless burdens draining the vitality of the nation. Children in classrooms were taught to calculate how much it cost to care for the disabled, reducing human life to numbers on a chalkboard. Doctors lent their authority to these campaigns, appearing in lectures and broadcasts to explain the necessity of eliminating hereditary disease. Public health, once a noble goal, was redefined as a weapon of exclusion. The German people were slowly desensitized to cruelty by a constant barrage of medicalized rhetoric. Medicine became propaganda, and propaganda became medicine. Together they normalized atrocities long before the camps began their work. The seeds of experimentation were sown in classrooms and cinemas. Individual doctors became notorious for their zeal in serving the Reich. But they were not anomalies. They were products of a corrupted system. Joseph Mengele, Karl Klarberg, and Sigmund Rascher would later achieve infamy for their experiments, but hundreds of lesser-known physicians shared their ideology. Local doctors identified patients for sterilization programs, signed certificates for euthanasia, and conducted research on unwilling subjects. Medical officers in the SS-staffed concentration camps, overseeing selections and deciding who lived or died. Surgeons performed operations without anesthesia, while researchers injected prisoners with diseases. These were not isolated acts of sadism, but practices sanctioned by the state and normalized within the profession. The perversion of medicine reached into every level of practice, from the village clinic to the university laboratory. No doctor could claim ignorance. The profession was fully entwined with the machinery of genocide. The white coat became as much a symbol of death as the black uniform of the SS. The betrayal of trust was absolute. The transformation of research institutions under Nazism also deserves scrutiny. Institutes once devoted to advancing knowledge redirected their work to serve military and racial objectives. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, a prestigious center of German science, conducted studies on heredity and race that provided intellectual cover for Nazi policies. Scientists competed for grants by proposing projects aligned with sterilization, euthanasia, or population control. Data gathered from sterilization campaigns and euthanasia programs were treated as valuable scientific resources. Researchers dissected the brains and organs of murdered children, attempting to link mental illness to racial characteristics. Universities exchanged corpses from euthanasia centers, treating victims as specimens rather than human beings. The line between research and atrocity dissolved as institutions sought favor from the regime. In doing so, they not only legitimized but industrialized the corruption of science. The prestige of German research was thus harnessed to justify barbarity. Knowledge itself had been weaponized. Complicity was not limited to a handful of elite institutions. It was nationwide. Hospitals sent patients to killing centers, doctors filled out death certificates with lies, and medical bureaucrats designed forms to streamline the process. Every layer of the medical system became a cog in the machinery of state violence. Some participated out of ambition, eager to advance their careers by aligning with Nazi ideology. Others did so out of conviction, genuinely believing in the pseudoscience of racial hygiene. A few complied out of fear, but their silence enabled atrocities as effectively as active participation. The sheer scale of medical involvement ensured that Nazi policies reached every corner of German society. The corruption of medicine was not hidden. It was visible, public, and systematic. By the late 1930s, the medical profession had been fully absorbed into the machinery of the Reich. Healing had been replaced with harm, and science with ideology. The transformation was complete before the war began. The perversion of medicine under the Nazis remains one of history's darkest warnings. Doctors, entrusted with the care of individuals, instead became agents of a state obsessed with purity and power. Universities, charged with advancing truth, became factories of propaganda dressed as science. Research institutions, meant to heal, became laboratories of death. Propaganda fused seamlessly with pseudoscience, erasing ethical boundaries and normalizing atrocity. The complicity of the medical profession gave legitimacy to policies that might otherwise have faced resistance. Their authority turned ideology into accepted fact, preparing society for genocide disguised as health policy. This betrayal of trust was not the work of a few madmen, but of a profession that abandoned its moral compass. The legacy of their choices would echo in the screams of camps and the scars of survivors. The Reich had found in medicine not a restraint, but a willing accomplice. It was within this corrupted profession that the darkest experiments in modern history would be born. The story of Nazi human experiments cannot be told without first examining the T4 euthanasia program, the blueprint for the machinery of mass murder. Named after its Berlin headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4, the program marked the regime's shift from sterilization to systematic killing. Beginning in 1939, the program targeted Germany's most vulnerable citizens, the disabled, the mentally ill, and those deemed unfit to live. Physicians, once guardians of the weak, became judges deciding life and death with a stroke of a pen. Patients in asylums and hospitals were evaluated not for treatment, but for termination. Doctors filled out forms, rating individuals by productivity and hereditary value, often without ever seeing them. Red crosses marked those condemned, sealing their fate in bureaucratic efficiency. The program operated in secrecy, but with state sanction, backed by Hitler's personal authorization. For many victims, death arrived in the guise of medical care. The T4 program was not an aberration, it was the beginning. The killings were disguised as therapy, cloaked in the language of medicine to maintain a veneer of legitimacy. Patients were told they were being transferred to specialized institutions for advanced treatment. Families received letters claiming their loved ones had died of natural causes such as pneumonia or heart failure. In reality, victims were loaded onto grey buses with painted-over windows, transported to killing centers across Germany and Austria. Facilities such as Hadamar, Grafeneck, Hartheim and Brandenburg became factories of death, designed to eliminate lives deemed worthless. Inside, patients were stripped, examined one last time by doctors, and then led into gas chambers disguised as showers. Carbon monoxide was pumped in from cylinders, killing dozens at once. Doctors observed, timing deaths, adjusting dosages, and recording outcomes as though conducting clinical trials. Nurses and staff disposed of bodies, cremating them in on-site ovens. Death was bureaucratized, medicalized, and industrialized. The illusion of care was maintained, even as healing institutions became slaughterhouses. The methods perfected in the T4 program would later be exported to the death camps of occupied Poland. The use of carbon monoxide, the design of gas chambers disguised as showers, and the bureaucratic efficiency of mass murder all originated in these killing centers. Engineers and doctors who oversaw the euthanasia program went on to design and operate facilities at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Cremation techniques tested at Hadamar were refined for larger operations in Auschwitz and Majdanek. Even the language of deception, calling killings special treatment or final medical procedures, was transplanted from hospitals to camps. In this way, the euthanasia program was both rehearsal and prototype for the Holocaust. The connection between medicine and genocide was no accident. The same doctors who killed children in hospital wards later selected victims on train ramps at Auschwitz. The T4 program was not simply about eliminating the disabled. It was about proving that mass killing could be organized, concealed, and justified as policy. Once proven, the scale could expand infinitely. The program also relied heavily on medical rationalizations, framing murder as mercy. Physicians argued that killing the disabled spared them from lives of suffering. Pamphlets and propaganda films portrayed patients as empty shells, existing without purpose, draining the nation's resources. The logic of utility replaced compassion, transforming human beings into economic burdens on state ledgers. Doctors calculated the cost of feeding and housing the disabled, presenting euthanasia as fiscal responsibility. The sick were described as lives unworthy of life, a chilling phrase that reduced humanity to accounting. Nurses, trained to comfort and heal, administered lethal injections of barbiturates, rationalizing that they were ending suffering. Autopsies were performed on the dead, harvesting organs and brains for research, further masking murder as science. In every step, medical authority was invoked to sanitize atrocity. Killing became a clinical procedure, its horror diluted by the sterile language of efficiency and necessity. This was genocide in a doctor's coat. The victims of T4 were not anonymous numbers. They were children, men, and women stripped of dignity and silenced by deceit. Children with disabilities were among the first targeted, taken from their parents under promises of specialized care. Many were subjected to starvation diets or lethal overdoses of medication, their deaths written off as natural decline. Adults suffering from mental illness, epilepsy, or physical deformities followed, transferred from institutions that had cared for them for years. The buses that carried them away became symbols of dread, their grey paint a travelling omen of death. Families were left bewildered and broken, receiving ashes in urns with fabricated explanations. Letters of condolence were mass-produced, signed by doctors who had overseen the killings. The sheer banality of the process was as terrifying as its brutality. It was not wild mobs or hidden assassins. It was trained professionals following orders, documenting results. The victims' lives ended not in chaos, but in silence and paperwork. Their erasure was as systematic as it was cruel. Opposition to the program did exist, but it was muted and rare. A few clergy, most famously Bishop Clemens August Graf von Galen of Münster, spoke out against the killings in fiery sermons. His denunciations reached enough of the public to cause unrest, forcing Hitler to officially suspend the program in 1941. But in reality, the killings never truly stopped. Decentralized euthanasia continued in hospitals and institutions, now disguised under local authority rather than central orders. Doctors and nurses quietly continued to administer lethal overdoses, starvation, and neglect to the disabled and mentally ill. The machinery of killing was simply dispersed, harder to track but still relentless. By 1945, estimates suggest over 200,000 people had been murdered under euthanasia policies. The program proved too valuable to abandon, both as practice for genocide and as an ideological pillar of Nazi racial hygiene. Silence and compliance among the medical community ensured its survival. Resistance was the exception, not the rule. The T4 program also blurred the boundaries between medicine, research, and cruelty. Autopsies conducted on victims provided data used in academic publications, presented as valuable contributions to science. Brains from murdered children were sent to research institutes, studied for supposed links between heredity and mental illness. Skeletal remains were collected for teaching, stripping victims of even posthumous dignity. Doctors who participated gained prestige, promotions, and access to funding, their careers built upon corpses. This convergence of murder and research normalized atrocities under the guise of progress. Universities became complicit, with professors eagerly requesting specimens from euthanasia centers. The line between treatment and experimentation vanished, replaced by a continuum of exploitation. Victims were not just killed, they were dissected, catalogued, and written into scholarly papers. Knowledge itself was contaminated by blood. The medical community's hunger for data merged seamlessly with the regime's hunger for destruction. Together, they legitimized and perpetuated the unthinkable. The legacy of the T4 euthanasia program is not only in the tens of thousands murdered, but in the way it paved the road to Auschwitz. It taught the Nazi state that mass killing could be hidden behind bureaucratic forms, justified by medical authority, and executed with chilling efficiency. It demonstrated that families could be deceived, the public could be pacified, and professionals could be complicit. The program proved that murder could be standardized, refined, and scaled. Techniques perfected in the gas chambers of Hadamar and Hartheim were directly transplanted to the extermination camps of Poland. The doctors who filled out death certificates for the disabled soon filled out transport lists for Jews. The ideological foundation of lives unworthy of life expanded from the disabled to entire peoples. What began in hospitals ended in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The T4 program was not a side note to the Holocaust, it was its opening act. In its shadows, the blueprint of genocide was written in medical ink. By the early 1940s, the Nazi concentration camp system had evolved from sites of detention into vast killing grounds, and within them, laboratories of human experimentation. Camps like Dachau, Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen became more than prisons. They were arenas where science and sadism converged. Prisoners were not seen as men and women, but as expendable subjects, stripped of rights and reduced to numbers tattooed onto their skin. Doctors and SS officers described them clinically as human material, erasing individuality with the cold precision of medical jargon. Behind barbed wire, the boundaries of ethics ceased to exist, replaced by the limitless authority of the Reich. Experiments could be conceived, approved, and executed without oversight, carried out on populations too weak to resist and too silenced to speak. Camp infirmaries, which should have been places of healing, were converted into operating theaters of cruelty. Barracks doubled as laboratories, filled not with equipment, but with suffering bodies. The camps became places where the Hippocratic oath was not only broken, but inverted. They were laboratories of death, disguised as sites of research. The transformation of camps into centers of experimentation was not accidental, it was deliberate and systematic. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler's direction, saw in the camps an inexhaustible supply of test subjects. Immune from public scrutiny and beyond the reach of law, experiments were often justified in terms of military necessity, such as testing survival in extreme conditions or developing treatments for battlefield injuries. At other times, they were purely ideological, seeking to prove racial theories or eliminate those considered unfit. Each experiment required selection, the process by which prisoners were chosen to live or die, to be tested or discarded. Doctors and guards made these decisions with bureaucratic detachment, standing at roll calls and pointing out men and women who would be taken away. Some were chosen because of their age, strength, or gender, others because they suffered from diseases that could be studied. Once selected, there was no appeal, no explanation, no escape. The chosen became raw material for experiments, their fate sealed in the silent nod of a doctor. In this way, selection became the prelude to torment. The secrecy surrounding these experiments was carefully maintained, concealed even from many within the SS. Doctors reported not to public institutions, but to private channels controlled by Himmler and the Reich's research offices. Files were stamped Geheim Reichssache, Reich secret matter, and stored in locked archives. Victims' names were rarely recorded. Instead, numbers and codes ensured anonymity, as though the subjects had never existed as human beings. Guards who assisted were sworn to silence, threatened with punishment if they revealed details of what they had seen. Survivors who witnessed experiments often did not live long afterward, ensuring that the truth remained hidden. Paperwork was couched in sterile language, referring to trials and procedures, avoiding words like torture or killing. The bureaucracy itself became a mask, hiding atrocity behind the appearance of clinical detachment. Only after the war would these files surface, exposing the scale of what had been done. Until then, secrecy allowed experiments to flourish unchecked, shielded by terror and deception. It was a silence bought with blood. At Dachau, one of the earliest sites of experimentation, prisoners were subjected to horrific tests under the guise of aiding the Luftwaffe. Freezing experiments immersed men in ice water to study hypothermia, while others were placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate high-altitude flight. At Ravensbrück, female prisoners were mutilated in bone and muscle experiments, their limbs deliberately wounded to test treatments. At Buchenwald, prisoners were infected with typhus and malaria, used as living test subjects for vaccines. Auschwitz, the largest killing center, became infamous not only for Mengelé's twin experiments, but for sterilization trials conducted with X-rays and chemicals. Each camp became a specialized laboratory, assigned projects tied to military, racial, or medical goals. Doctors coordinated across institutions, sharing results as though part of a legitimate research community. The scale was vast, involving thousands of victims across multiple locations. For the SS, the camps provided both a supply of test subjects and the means to dispose of them. Those who survived experiments often faced execution, their suffering erased in crematorium smoke. Camps became assembly lines of cruelty, refined to efficiency. The process of treating prisoners as human material was chillingly methodical. Doctors did not refer to them as patients, but as cases, objects to be observed, manipulated, and discarded. Prisoners were stripped of clothing, names, and identity, reduced to numbers sewn onto striped uniforms. In medical records, they were described not as individuals, but as subjects of experiment, often without age or background. Selection for experiments was carried out with the same cold efficiency as selection for the gas chambers. Some prisoners were chosen for their supposed racial features, others for their physical condition, and many simply for convenience. The dehumanization was deliberate, ensuring doctors could operate without empathy or hesitation. Prisoners were reminded constantly of their expendability, told that their suffering was irrelevant. The language of science created a psychological barrier between perpetrator and victim. In the sterile words of reports, agony was reduced to data points. Human beings became samples, their lives reduced to variables in a deadly experiment. The bureaucracy behind these experiments gave them an air of legitimacy, making atrocity appear as policy. Research proposals were submitted through SS channels, often approved by Himmler himself, who took a keen interest in medical experimentation. Funding was allocated, equipment requisitioned, and staff assigned as though these were ordinary scientific projects. Reports were filed regularly, detailing results in clinical language that masked the suffering behind them. Some projects were coordinated with prestigious institutions, including universities and pharmaceutical companies, which received data gathered from the camps. In this way, the experiments were integrated into the wider machinery of German science, blurring the line between crime and research. Scientists outside the camps accepted the findings without questioning the methods, complicit in their silence. The SS presented experiments as essential to the war effort, shielding them from scrutiny. Paperwork turned torture into routine, making the extraordinary appear ordinary. Bureaucracy became the lifeblood of atrocity, fueling its continuation. For prisoners, being selected for experimentation was often a slower death than the gas chamber. They endured repeated procedures, surgeries, without anesthesia, and infections introduced deliberately into their wounds. Many lingered for days or weeks in agony, their suffering prolonged for the sake of observation. Survivors were rare, often left crippled, sterilized, or permanently scarred. Those who lived were usually executed afterward, lest their testimonies expose the crimes. Fear of being chosen haunted the camp population, spreading despair as much as the roll calls themselves. Whispers circulated of the doctors and their experiments, of barracks where screams echoed at night. Some prisoners volunteered in desperation, hoping for better treatment, only to discover they had traded survival for torment. Others were taken without explanation, never to return. For those inside the wire, the laboratories were as feared as the gas chambers themselves. They were places where science became torture, and hope was extinguished. The transformation of concentration camps into laboratories of human experimentation marked one of the darkest convergences of science and state power. It was here that medicine, already corrupted by ideology, found its cruelest expression. The camps provided endless victims, secrecy, and the machinery of death, creating the perfect environment for atrocity disguised as research. Prisoners were stripped of humanity, turned into material to be studied, dissected, and discarded. Selection became a daily ritual, bureaucracy a mask, and cruelty a routine. The experiments that followed were not accidents of war, but deliberate policies carried out with precision and purpose. From freezing tanks to surgical mutilations, each act was documented as though it were legitimate science. The fusion of medicine and murder was complete. The camps had become both graveyards and laboratories. In them, the Nazi vision of science without conscience was realized in full. Among the many perpetrators of Nazi medical crimes, few names loom larger than Joseph Mengele, the so-called Angel of Death. Mengele was born in 1911 into a prosperous Bavarian family, educated in medicine and anthropology at prestigious universities. He was a gifted student, charming and ambitious, earning doctorates in both fields and publishing work on racial biology. When war broke out, he joined the Waffen-SS, rising quickly through the ranks with a reputation for loyalty and zeal. In 1943, he was assigned to Auschwitz, where his blend of scientific curiosity and ideological devotion made him the perfect instrument of Nazi racial policy. Mengele presided over selections at the train ramps, casually deciding who would live, who would work, and who would die. His particular obsession was twins, whom he saw as living laboratories for genetic research. To prisoners, his immaculate uniform and calm demeanor concealed unimaginable cruelty. He represented the perversion of medicine into murder, cloaked in the authority of science. At Auschwitz, Mengele became both doctor and executioner. Karl Klauberg, another notorious figure, pursued his ambitions not through genetics, but through reproductive science. A gynecologist by training, Klauberg was obsessed with developing mass sterilization techniques that could be applied to entire populations. His work was not motivated solely by curiosity, but by the Nazi desire to control reproduction among those deemed inferior. At Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, he conducted brutal experiments on women, injecting caustic substances into their wombs to render them infertile. Victims screamed in agony as their reproductive organs were destroyed. Infections spread, and many died from complications. Klauberg recorded his results meticulously, boasting to Himmler that he could sterilize thousands with minimal effort. He saw his work not as cruelty, but as innovation, a contribution to racial hygiene. His ambition was matched only by his ideological zeal, seeing women not as patients but as instruments of population control. For Klauberg, medicine had no meaning beyond the service of the Reich. His experiments embodied the cold efficiency of genocide disguised as science. Sigmund Rascher, a physician at Dachau, became infamous for his freezing and high-altitude experiments. Backed by the Luftwaffe, and personally supported by Himmler, Rascher sought to solve problems of pilot survival in extreme conditions. Prisoners were submerged in ice water tanks, their bodies monitored as they shivered, convulsed, and eventually died. Others were placed in low-pressure chambers to simulate the thin air at high altitudes, their lungs bursting and brains starved of oxygen. Rascher observed with clinical detachment, recording the stages of death as though charting an experiment with animals. He justified his cruelty as service to the war effort, insisting that the suffering of a few prisoners could save countless German pilots. In reality, his experiments were riddled with scientific flaws, offering little usable data. Yet his willingness to kill made him valuable to the regime, at least temporarily. Rascher's ambition, however, proved his undoing, as corruption and deceit led to his eventual arrest by the SS itself. Even among murderers, he was consumed by his own greed and ruthlessness. Other doctors, less infamous but no less cruel, contributed to the machinery of experimentation. At Buchenwald, Erwin Dingschuler infected prisoners with typhus, monitoring the spread of disease and testing vaccines. At Ravensbrück, doctors like Herta Oberheiser mutilated women in bone and muscle experiments, leaving survivors crippled for life. Kurt Blome, Deputy Surgeon General of the Reich, oversaw experiments with plague and other biological weapons. Edward Worths, Chief Medical Officer at Auschwitz, supervised selections and ensured medical experiments ran smoothly. These figures were not all sadists in the stereotypical sense. Many were bureaucrats in white coats, carrying out tasks with chilling efficiency. Their loyalty was not only to ideology, but to career advancement, eager to impress superiors and secure recognition. Each justified their actions through the warped lens of Nazi science, believing themselves pioneers rather than criminals. Together, they formed a network of doctors of death, spanning camps and institutions across Europe. Their names may be less well known, but their impact was immense. They ensured that atrocity was systematized, routinized, and sustained. The personalities of these doctors varied, but their ambitions shared a common thread: the pursuit of prestige within the Nazi system. Mengele craved recognition as a brilliant scientist, seeing twins as his path to fame. Kleiberg sought patents for his sterilization techniques, hoping to leave a lasting mark on medicine. Rascher used his proximity to Himmler to advance his career, parading his experiments as essential to the Luftwaffe. Others pursued research grants, professorships, or military honors, all of which the regime dangled as rewards. Ideology provided justification, but ambition provided motivation. These men were not compelled by fear, they chose to act, seizing opportunities to advance themselves through cruelty. Their victims were reduced to stepping stones on the path to professional glory. Within the Reich, success meant proving loyalty through results. No matter how horrific, the convergence of ambition and ideology created a perfect storm of inhumanity. In the camps, medicine was no longer about healing, but about climbing ladders stained with blood. Ideological loyalty bound these doctors to the regime as tightly as ambition. They embraced the belief that some lives were unworthy and others worth preserving at any cost. Their experiments were framed as contributions to the Volk, sacrifices demanded for the health of the racial community. By dehumanizing their victims as Jews, Roma, or political undesirables, they silenced any remnants of conscience. Propaganda reinforced their worldview, portraying the camps as repositories of degeneracy where research could purify the future. In this context, cruelty became duty, and murder became medicine. To question the ethics of their work would have been to question the ideology of the Reich itself. Instead, they embraced it, turning ideology into a shield against moral reckoning. Their loyalty was not passive. It was active, creative, and sustained. They did not simply follow orders, they designed them, implemented them, and expanded them. The line between doctor and executioner was erased by ideology. The justifications these doctors offered for their atrocities were couched in the language of science. They spoke of trials, observations, and procedures, never of torture, mutilation, or murder. Reports were filled with charts, measurements, and conclusions, creating the illusion of legitimate research. In truth, most of the experiments were scientifically worthless, plagued by poor methodology, bias, and the absence of ethical rigor. But the appearance of science was enough to satisfy their superiors, who valued loyalty and results over accuracy. Victims were not subjects of healing, but variables in equations of cruelty. The doctors convinced themselves that their work served higher goals: military victory, racial purity, or medical advancement. By cloaking atrocity in scientific language, they insulated themselves from guilt. To the outside world, their reports could be mistaken for ordinary medical studies. Only the screams of the dying betrayed the reality. Science had become the mask of barbarity. The doctors of death exemplify the darkest possibilities of human ambition and ideology unchecked. They were not madmen operating in isolation, but trained professionals shaped by universities, institutions, and a system that rewarded cruelty. Their work was not fringe, but central, integrated into the policies of the Reich and supported by its highest leaders. They wielded scalpels and syringes as weapons, transforming patients into prisoners and prisoners into corpses. Each believed himself justified, whether by science, ideology, or ambition. Together, they created a medical landscape where healing was perverted into harm. Their legacy is a warning of what happens when science is severed from conscience, when ambition outruns ethics, and when ideology eclipses humanity. They turned laboratories into death chambers and operating rooms into torture sites. The world would learn their names through trials, testimonies, and the whispered memories of survivors. They remained symbols of a profession's greatest betrayal. When Joseph Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in 1943, He carried with him an obsession that would define his legacy: the study of twins as a pathway to understanding heredity. The Nazi regime, steeped in racial ideology, sought proof that Aryan superiority was biological, etched into the very genes of its people. Mengele believed that twins offered a natural laboratory, allowing him to compare genetic and environmental influences side by side. To him, they were not children, not siblings, but living specimens, perfect subjects for his pursuit of racial science. His selections at the train ramps became infamous. As families were torn apart, twins were spared the gas chambers, plucked from the lines by Mengele's pointing hand. Parents and siblings were sent to their deaths, while twins were marched to special barracks known as the Kinderlager. At first, many children felt relief at being spared, not realizing the price that would follow. To Mengele, they were not rescues, but acquisitions. Their survival was conditional, tethered to their value as data. In his gaze, they were treasures of science, stripped of humanity. The twin barracks at Auschwitz became the center of Mengele's cruel laboratory. Hundreds of pairs of Jewish and Roma twins, many of them children, were housed together under the constant surveillance of SS guards and medical staff. The barracks, though slightly cleaner than others, were still filled with fear, disease, and hunger. Twins were measured daily with obsessive precision. Their height, weight, head circumference, and even the diameter of their eyes were recorded. Blood was drawn repeatedly, often leaving children weak and dizzy. Their veins collapsed from overuse. X-rays and photographs documented their bodies, transforming their existence into a catalogue of numbers and images. Mengele himself, immaculately dressed, would stride into the barracks with charm and gentleness, handing out sweets before ordering brutal procedures. His dual persona, the smiling benefactor and the ruthless scientist, confused and terrified his young subjects. To the children, he was both protector and predator. The barracks were not homes, but cages disguised as dormitories. Every day carried the dread of what experiment might come next. Mengele's experiments on twins were varied, invasive, and often fatal. Some involved injecting mysterious substances into one twin while keeping the other as a control, observing differences until one or both succumbed. In other cases, twins were deliberately infected with diseases such as typhus or tuberculosis, their suffering charted with clinical detachment. Blood transfusions were forced between siblings, regardless of compatibility, leading to painful reactions and death. Surgical procedures were carried out without anesthesia, including organ removals, amputations, and attempts to join twins physically. Mengele hoped to uncover secrets of heredity, fertility, and even the possibility of influencing multiple births to increase the Aryan population. Many children screamed in agony, their cries echoing through the camp, but their suffering was reduced to entries in notebooks. When one twin died, the other was often killed immediately, so that comparative autopsies could be performed. Brains, organs, and tissues were dissected and catalogued, stored in jars for study. The experiments were not science, but sadism masked as research. They destroyed lives for illusions of discovery. The rituals of measurement and testing became part of daily existence for the twins. Each morning, they were lined up for inspections, stripped naked, while doctors noted every scar, freckle, and detail of their bodies. Hours were spent in humiliating examinations, treated as objects rather than children. Needles pierced their skin constantly, drawing blood, injecting chemicals, or introducing infections. They endured repeated X-rays that left burns, as well as transfusions that made them faint and vomit. Some were forced into endurance trials, made to stand or sit in fixed positions for hours while data was recorded. Others were subjected to dental extractions, eye color experiments, or spinal punctures. The monotony of fear was broken only by terror, as experiments escalated unpredictably. Many longed for death, yet clung to each other as their only source of comfort. Their twinship, which should have been a bond of love, was turned into a sentence of torture. Auschwitz became the place where childhood was dissected, one measurement at a time. The cruelty of these experiments was not only physical, but psychological. Mengele played with the children's emotions, alternating between affection and brutality. He would smile, pat their heads, and speak kindly, before sending them to surgeries that would leave them maimed or dead. This manipulation created a sense of confusion and betrayal, blurring the lines between care and cruelty. Twins often clung to each other for protection, drawing strength from their shared suffering. Yet that bond was also exploited, as the death of one almost always meant the death of the other. Children watched helplessly as their siblings were mutilated or killed, knowing they would soon follow. The barracks echoed with grief, as survivors were forced to live alongside memories of lost brothers and sisters. Mengele's experiments shattered not just bodies, but the most intimate human connection, the bond between twins. In this way, the cruelty was doubled, magnified by the very relationship he sought to study. Pain became paired, and death became shared. Survivor testimonies provide the most haunting window into these atrocities. Eva Mosey's Core, one of the few twins to survive, recalled the endless injections whose contents were never explained. She described being bedridden for weeks with high fevers, certain she would die while Mengele stood by her bed taking notes. Miriam Moses, her twin, suffered long-term kidney damage from the experiments, effects that lasted her entire life. Other survivors told of watching siblings die in agony, their bodies dissected while the surviving twin was forced to witness. Some remembered Mengele's cold fascination, his eyes alight not with empathy but with curiosity. These testimonies reveal the calculated cruelty that statistics and reports cannot capture. They remind us that behind every case study was a child robbed of innocence. Survivors carried not only physical scars but lifelong trauma, haunted by the memory of those they lost. Their voices are fragile but vital, preserving truth against denial. They ensure that the twin experiments are remembered not as abstract horror, but as lived nightmare. The aftermath of the twin experiments left few survivors, and those who endured were forever changed. Many lived with chronic illnesses, infertility, or disabilities inflicted by the procedures. Psychological scars ran even deeper, manifesting in nightmares, depression, and survivors' guilt. For decades, some remained silent, unable to speak of what had been done to them. Others became witnesses, determined to tell the world the truth, despite the pain it evoked. The medical community, after the war, universally condemned Mengele's work as scientifically worthless, devoid of methodology or validity. His data, gathered through torture and death, was unusable, tainted by its origins and its lack of rigor. Mengele himself escaped justice, fleeing to South America, where he lived under false identities until his death in 1979. His name became synonymous with cruelty, the very image of medicine corrupted into monstrosity. Yet the true legacy of his experiments is found not in his notes, but in the survivors. Their resilience became a counterpoint to his brutality. Their survival ensured that his crimes could never be erased. The twin experiments at Auschwitz symbolized the grotesque extremes of Nazi science. They embodied the obsession with heredity, the dehumanization of victims, and the willingness of doctors to cross every boundary of ethics. Children, the most innocent of humanity, were reduced to specimens, their pain transformed into data. Mengele's charisma and authority masked his atrocities, proving that evil can wear the face of gentleness. The experiments served no scientific purpose, but they served the ideology of the Reich, providing false validation for theories of racial superiority. Today, the testimonies of survivors stand as living monuments, exposing the lies behind Mengeler's pursuit. Their voices turn numbers back into names, restoring humanity to those who were dehumanized. Auschwitz, already the greatest symbol of industrialized death, became under Mengele a place of medicalized torture. The twin experiments remain one of the most chilling examples of science without conscience. They remind us of the thin line between healing and harm, and of the necessity of ethics in every pursuit of knowledge. The Nazi state was obsessed with reproduction, seeing the womb as a battlefield upon which the future of the Reich would be decided. For Aryan women deemed racially pure, motherhood was glorified, rewarded with medals and subsidies, their fertility celebrated as a contribution to the Volk. For those considered undesirable, Jews, Roma, Slavs, and the disabled, reproduction was a threat, a contamination of the racial body. This obsession drove policies that sought not only to encourage births among the superior, but to prevent or eliminate births among the inferior. Sterilization became a weapon of social engineering, a medicalized form of genocide aimed at extinguishing entire bloodlines. The goal was not just murder, but the prevention of future generations, erasing people before they could be born. Camps like Auschwitz and Ravensbrück became laboratories where this vision was tested with cold precision. Men and women were selected not for immediate death, but for procedures that would rob them of their fertility. Reproduction was politicized, controlled, and weaponized. The very ability to give life was turned into a tool of destruction. Mass sterilization began long before the camps, with laws passed in 1933 mandating the sterilization of hundreds of thousands deemed hereditarily ill. But inside the camps, sterilization took on new forms, tested on unwilling prisoners to develop methods that could be applied quickly and on a large scale. One of the most common techniques was the use of X-rays, directed at the reproductive organs of men and women. Prisoners were forced to lie under machines, while high doses of radiation burned their tissue, leaving them in excruciating pain. Many suffered burns, ulcers, and infections. Some died within days from complications. Men reported swollen testicles and searing pain, while women endured inflammation, hemorrhaging, and permanent damage. The procedures were carried out without anesthesia, amplifying the suffering. To the doctors, the goal was efficiency, how to sterilize as many people as possible with minimal effort. The victims were reduced to test subjects in a grotesque search for industrialized infertility. Their agony was written into reports, stripped of humanity. Chemical sterilization represented another avenue of experimentation. Prisoners, often women, were injected directly into the uterus with caustic substances designed to destroy reproductive tissue. These injections caused unbearable pain, cramping, and fever, often leading to sepsis and death. Survivors were left infertile, their wombs scarred beyond repair, their bodies permanently damaged. At Ravensbrück, women screamed in agony as injections of iodine, silver nitrate, and other chemicals tore through their insides. Many bled uncontrollably, some fainted from shock, and others died within hours. Doctors recorded their observations with clinical detachment, noting degrees of damage as though charting progress. The women were never informed of what was being done to them, nor given the chance to refuse. They were lined up, experimented upon, and discarded. Chemical sterilization was portrayed as efficient and cost-effective, a means of achieving racial goals without mass executions. But for the victims, it was nothing less than medical torture. Surgical sterilization also played a central role in the Nazi arsenal. Prisoners were subjected to operations in filthy camp infirmaries, their fallopian tubes tied or ovaries removed without consent. Men underwent castration, sometimes performed crudely with minimal equipment, leaving them mutilated and in agony. These surgeries were often performed by doctors with little regard for hygiene or survival, resulting in infections and deaths. Survivors were left with lasting pain, scar tissue, and an inability to have children. Women were sometimes operated on repeatedly, used as practice for surgeons or to test different techniques. Each cut into living flesh was justified as scientific inquiry, but in reality it was an assault on identity and humanity. Reproduction, the most intimate of human functions, was violated at its core. The ability to create life was stripped away with scalpels and sutures. For the Nazis, sterilization was not a medical procedure. It was a weapon of annihilation. Entire futures were erased on operating tables of cruelty. Karl Klauberg emerged as one of the most notorious figures in these experiments. A gynecologist by training, he approached sterilization with cold ambition, seeing it as an opportunity to contribute to the Reich while advancing his career. At Auschwitz and later Ravensbrück, Klauberg conducted mass experiments on women, injecting chemical solutions into their wombs. He claimed his method could sterilize thousands efficiently, turning reproductive health into a system of industrialized control. Victims endured horrific pain, fevers, and permanent damage, with many dying from infections. Klauberg boasted of his results to Himmler, describing his work not as cruelty but as innovation. He envisioned entire populations sterilized with minimal resources, a logistical solution to the Nazi obsession with racial purity. His patients were not women, not individuals, but data points in his reports. Klauberg's ambition and ideological zeal fused into atrocity. He became the embodiment of medicine, transformed into a weapon of genocide. Horst Schumann was another doctor who played a central role in sterilization experiments, particularly with X-rays. At Auschwitz and later Ravensbrück, Schumann directed radiation at the reproductive organs of men and women, seeking to perfect a technique that could be applied en masse. Prisoners screamed in pain as their flesh blistered and their insides burned. Many were left with open sores, internal bleeding, and permanent disability. Men were castrated after radiation destroyed their testicles, while women were mutilated when radiation burned through their wombs. Schumann, detached and clinical, charted these outcomes as though recording successes. Survivors remembered his indifference, the way he treated agony as routine. His experiments, like Klauberg's, produced nothing of scientific value, only suffering. Yet he remained convinced he was serving the Reich by eliminating the fertility of its enemies. Schumann's work stands as a testament to how science can be twisted into cruelty. Under his hand, X-rays became instruments of destruction. The sterilization experiments were not only about science, they were about ideology and control. By robbing prisoners of the ability to reproduce, the Nazis aimed to erase entire peoples from history. Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable were targeted not only for death, but for the prevention of life itself. It was a form of genocide that reached into the future, silencing generations yet unborn. Survivors carried the scars not only of mutilation, but of stolen identity, robbed of the chance to have families. For women, the trauma was compounded by shame, silence, and lifelong pain. For men, castration left both physical and psychological wounds, stripping them of dignity. The experiments served no scientific purpose. Their purpose was ideological annihilation. Sterilization was genocide by another name, cloaked in the language of research. It was the destruction of possibility, the erasure of lineage. It revealed the Nazi obsession with controlling life at its most intimate level. The legacy of sterilization experiments is measured not only in deaths, but in lives never lived. The women who survived could not bear children, the men could not father them, and families that might have been were obliterated. These experiments stand as stark reminders that genocide is not only about killing, but about preventing life. The cruelty was not incidental, it was intentional, woven into the very fabric of Nazi ideology. Klarberg, Schumann, and others justified their actions as service to science and the Reich. But in truth, they served only destruction. Their victims were left with pain that outlasted the war, scars that shaped every day of their survival. Modern medicine rejects their work as worthless, built on brutality rather than knowledge. But history preserves it as a warning. Science without ethics can become an instrument of horror. The sterilization experiments remain among the most grotesque violations of human dignity in modern history. They reveal how ambition and ideology can twist the tools of healing into weapons of erasure. Chapter 8: Hypothermia and Survival Experiments. The frozen fields of the Eastern Front and the frigid waters of the North Sea provided the Nazis with a deadly problem: how to keep their soldiers alive in extreme cold. The Luftwaffe, facing mounting losses as pilots bailed into icy waters or crash-landed in snowbound terrain, turned to medical research for solutions. At Dachau, one of the earliest concentration camps, this question of survival became the pretext for some of the most notorious experiments of the war. Sigmund Rascher, a physician with close ties to Heinrich Himmler, took charge of these studies, cloaking cruelty in the language of military necessity. The camp's prisoners, already dehumanized, became the unwilling test subjects for his freezing and high-altitude experiments. What unfolded inside Dachau's barracks and laboratories bore no resemblance to legitimate science. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated cycle of suffering, observation, and death. Rascher reported his findings in clinical tones, disguising murder as medicine. His experiments promised solutions for German pilots, but they cost countless lives. Dachau became a frozen laboratory of horror. The freezing experiments began in 1942 with a simple but brutal question: how long could a man survive in icy water? Prisoners were stripped naked and forced into large tanks filled with ice-cold water, their heads restrained to prevent escape. As the minutes passed, their bodies shivered violently, skin turned blue, and consciousness faded. Rascher and his team stood by with stopwatches, recording heart rates, respiration, and the onset of hypothermic shock. Some victims lasted less than an hour, others endured for 3 before death claimed them. Survivors were often revived, not with warmth, but with cruel and experimental rewarming techniques, such as scalding hot baths or forced intercourse with female prisoners. Many died in the process, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma. Rascher described their deaths, not with empathy, but with data points, as though cataloguing the decline of laboratory animals. Each test stripped men of dignity, reducing their suffering to numbers. The ice water tanks became silent execution chambers, masquerading as research. Another series of experiments focused on freezing men outdoors in the harsh Bavarian winter. Prisoners were left naked in fields or strapped down in the open air, exposed to wind and sub-zero temperatures. Their agony was prolonged as frostbite set in and bodies convulsed uncontrollably. Rascher sometimes poured water over them to accelerate freezing, intensifying the torment. Guards and doctors watched with clinical interest, recording the stages of hypothermia in meticulous detail. Some victims begged for mercy, others grew delirious, speaking incoherently before slipping into unconsciousness. Dogs were sometimes unleashed to lick frostbitten bodies, part of grotesque attempts at rewarming. These outdoor experiments demonstrated not just the cruelty of the procedures, but their utter disregard for human life. The prisoners were not seen as men with families, names, and histories. They were test subjects chosen to die for data. Their frozen corpses littered the fields around Diachol, each one a casualty of science corrupted by ideology. The cold became both method and executioner. Alongside freezing, Russia conducted high-altitude experiments designed to simulate conditions faced by Luftwaffe pilots. A low-pressure chamber was installed at Dachau, capable of replicating altitudes of up to 20,000 meters. Prisoners were locked inside, strapped to chairs as the air was slowly evacuated. At extreme altitudes, many convulsed violently, foamed at the mouth, or suffered seizures as oxygen deprivation ravaged their bodies. Some tore at their restraints, desperate for air, before collapsing unconscious. Rascher observed with detachment, taking notes as brains swelled, lungs ruptured, and hearts failed. Autopsies were performed immediately after death, dissecting organs to study the effects of altitude. Hundreds perished in these chambers, their final moments marked by terror and suffocation. Reports described the results clinically, as if these deaths were no different from laboratory trials on animals. The chamber at Dachau became a coffin of airlessness, a place where science was conducted at the cost of life itself. Rascher's methods of revival were as cruel as the experiments themselves. Prisoners pulled from freezing tanks were sometimes plunged into boiling water, their skin blistering as bodies went into shock. Others were placed between two naked female prisoners in attempts at animal warmth, a degradation for both victim and women, coerced into participation. Some were forced into scalding baths, others rubbed violently until their skin tore. Each method was recorded meticulously, as though innovation could be found in torture. Rascher presented these revival trials as practical, intended to discover the best ways to save German pilots downed in the North Sea. In reality, the chaotic, inconsistent procedures produced little usable knowledge. Survivors of the revival often died soon afterward, their bodies overwhelmed by the trauma. Rascher did not care for their survival, only for the data extracted in the process. Remorming became not a rescue but another experiment. Even in life-saving trials, death was the most frequent outcome. The Luftwaffe eagerly accepted Rascher's reports, citing them as essential contributions to aviation medicine. Himmler himself praised the experiments, seeing in them a model of how the camps could serve the Reich's needs. Conferences were held where Rascher presented his findings to military doctors, who listened without protest to data gathered through suffering and death. The language of science gave these atrocities legitimacy, cloaking murder in the appearance of research. Yet many physicians in attendance knew the truth, that the methods were barbaric, the data unreliable, and the costs unthinkable. Some ignored the flaws, more concerned with the regime's approval than with scientific integrity. Rascher's reputation grew, though whispers of corruption and cruelty followed him. His work illustrates how easily institutions can be corrupted when ethics are abandoned. The Luftwaffe, desperate for solutions, turned a blind eye to the human toll. In doing so, it became complicit in the crimes committed at Dachau. Science stripped of conscience became indistinguishable from atrocity. For the prisoners subjected to Rascher's experiments, survival was rare and often worse than death. Those who endured the freezing or altitude tests were left with lasting damage, nerve pain, organ failure, or permanent disability. Psychological scars haunted them, as memories of suffocation and cold resurfaced in nightmares. Some survivors testified after the war, their voices trembling as they recounted the minutes spent gasping for air or thrashing in ice. Their stories revealed details no report could capture: the taste of frozen lips, the sound of hearts slowing, the terror of waiting for death. Many could never escape the sense of betrayal, knowing that doctors, symbols of healing, had become their tormentors. Families were destroyed, children left without fathers, and communities scarred by the absence of those taken. The suffering reached far beyond the camp walls, echoing through generations. Survivors bore witness, not for science but for truth. Their testimonies gave names to numbers, humanity to statistics. They ensured that the victims of Dachau would not be forgotten. The hypothermia and survival experiments at Dachau remain among the most infamous examples of science perverted into cruelty. Rascher's freezing tanks, ice water immersions, and altitude chambers were not designed to save lives, but to sacrifice them for hollow data. The Luftwaffe's Complicity revealed how military goals can corrupt medicine, turning survival studies into instruments of death. The suffering of hundreds produced no legitimate breakthroughs, only scars on history and on the bodies of survivors. Rascher himself fell from grace, arrested by the SS for fraud and executed before the war's end. Yet his legacy lingers, a symbol of how easily authority can weaponize science. Today his reports are rejected, condemned as worthless, both scientifically and morally. But the memory of the men who froze, suffocated, and screamed inside Dachau remains. Their deaths testify to the dangers of research divorced from ethics, ambition unchecked by morality. In their agony, the world sees the true cost of survival, research built on human lives. The legacy of World War I hung heavily over the German military, for it was in those trenches that chemical warfare had first scarred the conscience of the modern world. Chlorine, mustard gas, and phosgene had blinded, burned, and suffocated soldiers by the tens of thousands. Though the Geneva Protocol of 1925 outlawed the use of chemical weapons, research continued in secret laboratories across Europe, including Germany. By the time of the Second World War, the Nazis had stockpiled vast arsenals of chemical agents, including mustard gas and newer compounds. Fearful of Allied use, yet tempted by their own power, the regime turned to concentration camps to test the effects and possible treatments of these weapons. Prisoners, stripped of humanity, became experimental subjects for chemical warfare research. The laboratories of death expanded their scope, moving from cold and altitude to poisons and toxins. It was framed as preparation for war, but in reality it was systematic torture. Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and other camps became theaters of chemical experimentation. The victims would bear the agony on their skin, lungs, and eyes. Mustard gas, one of the most infamous chemical agents from the First World War, became a central focus of Nazi testing. Prisoners were deliberately exposed to the gas, their skin erupting in blisters and ulcers that burned with excruciating pain. Eyes swelled shut, lungs filled with fluid, and bodies convulsed in coughing fits that racked them to exhaustion. Doctors observed with clipboards in hand, timing the onset of symptoms and charting the progression of the burns. Some prisoners were forced into chambers filled with the vapor, while others had liquid mustard applied directly to shaved patches of skin. The blisters often grew infected, turning into open sores that emitted foul odors. Victims were denied proper medical care, their suffering prolonged for the sake of observation. Many died slowly, choking on their own damaged lungs. For those who survived, the scars were permanent, skin disfigured, vision impaired, lungs irreparably damaged. Mustard gas became not just a weapon of war, but a tool of experimentation in the camps. Phosgene, another relic of the Great War, was equally devastating in the hands of Nazi doctors. Known for its delayed but deadly effects, it was inhaled by unsuspecting prisoners placed in sealed chambers. At first, they felt little more than irritation in the throat, but hours later their lungs began to fill with fluid. Victims gasped for air, drowning internally as pulmonary edema suffocated them from within. Doctors recorded the slow suffocation, noting times and symptoms as though studying an animal trial. The agony was extended deliberately, with no effort to alleviate it. Autopsies were performed to examine fluid-filled lungs, dissecting organs still swollen with poison. Prisoners were numbers, their agony translated into data points on paper. Phosgene was tested not for treatment, but to confirm its deadly efficiency. The experiments revealed nothing new, only reaffirming truths long known. The victims' lives were spent, wasted on repetition of knowledge already acquired in the trenches of 1915. Other chemical agents were also tested, each bringing its own particular horror. In some cases, acids and caustic substances were applied to prisoners' skin to study tissue destruction. In others, smoke bombs and irritants were detonated in confined spaces, forcing men to inhale choking fumes. Eye experiments involved dripping poisons into the eyes of victims, blinding them while doctors charted the rate of vision loss. Poisoned bullets were even tested, fired into prisoners, so that doctors could observe the combination of gunshot wounds and toxic effects. Each experiment blended cruelty with pointless repetition, for the results were already well documented in military science. Yet for the Nazis, repetition mattered less than exploitation. Prisoners provided endless bodies to use, discard, and replace. Chemical weapons research was integrated into the wider network of camp experiments, feeding data to military offices in Berlin. The costs, measured in lives, were incalculable. The methods, cloaked in the language of research, were indistinguishable from torture. Each victim became a testament to the perversion of science into sadism. In addition to studying the effects of poisons, Nazi doctors also tested supposed cures and treatments on their unwilling subjects. Mustard gas burns were treated with experimental ointments, rubbed into raw blisters while victims screamed in pain. Infections were deliberately induced in wounds to test the efficacy of antiseptics and antibiotics. Some victims were denied food and water as part of controlled conditions, their weakened bodies less able to resist the toxins. Prisoners were given injections of untested drugs, their reactions monitored with clinical detachment. In many cases, the treatments were more painful than the exposure itself, compounding the agony. Failures were frequent, and when subjects died, their deaths were chalked up as part of the research. Autopsies followed, with skin, lungs, and organs harvested for further study. The promise of a cure was not for the victims themselves. They were never meant to be saved. Instead, their bodies became platforms for experimentation, sacrificed in the name of medicine warped by war. Healing was a pretense. Suffering was the real objective. The justifications offered for these experiments echoed those of other camp research. They were said to serve the Reich, to save German soldiers, to protect pilots and troops from Allied weapons. In reality, they produced little of scientific or military value. The methods were sloppy, the conditions uncontrolled, the sample sizes inconsistent. Ethical standards were absent, rendering the data unreliable even if it had been collected honestly. But the appearance of scientific effort was enough to satisfy superiors like Himmler, who prized loyalty over rigor. Reports were filed with official seals, giving atrocity the appearance of research. Doctors gained prestige and career advancement by presenting their findings, even as their victims lay in unmarked graves. Pharmaceutical companies occasionally collaborated, receiving data that could never have been gathered ethically. This intersection of industry and atrocity blurred the lines further, showing how profit and ideology could unite in cruelty. The Reich's war machine demanded results, and doctors delivered them, no matter the human cost. For the prisoners, chemical experiments brought some of the most agonizing deaths in the camps. Unlike the swift killings of the gas chambers, these deaths unfolded over hours or days, skin blistered until it sloughed away, eyes clouded with blindness, and lungs drowned slowly in their own secretions. Survivors described unbearable pain, coughing blood, and an endless thirst as their bodies failed. Those who lived often carried scars for life, disfigured faces, crippled lungs, and blindness that could never be healed. The experiments robbed not only their health, but their dignity, reducing them to test animals in the eyes of their captors. Families were left without fathers, mothers, or children, their lives cut short by poison in the name of research. The camp itself reeked of chemicals after experiments, the stench of burned skin mingling with the smoke of crematoria. Survivors never forgot the smell, the sight, or the agony. For them, chemical warfare was not an abstraction, it was their lived reality. The poison and chemical weapons experiments reveal the darkest extremes of Nazi medical research. Under the guise of protecting soldiers, they inflicted suffering on prisoners whose only crime was their existence. Mustard gas, phosgene, acids, and toxins turned human beings into disposable instruments of study. Treatments tested were never meant to heal, only to expand the reach of military power. In the process, the very concept of medicine was desecrated, transformed into an accomplice of mass murder. The legacy of these experiments is not found in scientific advancement, for they contributed nothing of value. Instead, it lies in the scars left on survivors and in the silence of the dead. They remind us that war can twist science into a weapon and doctors into executioners. At Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and beyond, the victims of chemical experiments were written out of reports but not out of history. Their suffering endures as testimony to the cost of science without conscience. Disease haunted the camps as relentlessly as hunger and brutality, and the Nazis weaponized it for their experiments. Typhus, malaria, tuberculosis, and other infections were deliberately introduced into prisoners' bodies, transforming illness into a tool of research. The justification was always cloaked in military necessity. The Wehrmacht, fighting in harsh and unsanitary conditions on the Eastern Front, needed vaccines and treatments to protect its soldiers. But in truth, the camps provided a human reservoir for experiments that could never have been justified outside their barbed wire fences. Prisoners were deliberately infected, their suffering carefully monitored, their deaths reduced to data points. In the shadow of crematoria, barracks doubled as sick rooms where medicine was inverted into torture. The victims had no choice, no consent, no possibility of escape. Their bodies became battlefields in a war between pathogens and cruel science. For the doctors, it was an opportunity to test, measure, and publish. For the prisoners, it was a sentence of suffering and death disguised as care. Typhus was one of the deadliest diseases tested, and Buchenwald became its main laboratory. Prisoners were injected with strains of the typhus bacterium, their fevers monitored as the infection spread. The illness produced rashes, delirium, and excruciating pain, followed by organ failure and death in many cases. Doctors observed the stages with clinical detachment, charting the decline of men who writhed in agony on wooden bunks. Some were given experimental vaccines, many of them untested or contaminated, while others served as controls, left untreated to die. Victims who survived the first round were often reinfected, their bodies pushed to exhaustion to compare responses. Mortality rates were staggering, with hundreds dying in each round of trials. Those who perished were dissected, their organs studied for clues about the disease's pathology. The results added little to what was already known in medical science, but the suffering was immeasurable. Typhus became not just a scourge of war, but a weapon of experimentation. Malaria experiments were carried out most extensively at Dachau, where hundreds of prisoners were bitten by infected mosquitoes or directly injected with the parasite. The goal, supposedly, was to test anti-malarial drugs for soldiers stationed in southern Europe or Africa. Prisoners endured high fevers, chills, and uncontrollable shaking, their bodies weakened by starvation and camp conditions. Some were given treatments such as quinine or new synthetic compounds, while others were left untreated as comparisons. The results were unpredictable. Drugs often caused side effects worse than the disease itself, leaving victims vomiting, delirious, or dead. Prisoners were recycled through cycles of infection and treatment, their bodies used until they failed. Doctors measured parasite levels in blood samples, counting the days until collapse. Many died after repeated exposures, their immune systems shattered. Dachau's malaria trials revealed little of medical value, but they left a trail of graves and grief. For the prisoners, malaria was not a natural disease, it was forced upon them as punishment disguised as research. Tuberculosis also became a focus of experimentation, particularly at camps like Neuengamme and Auschwitz. Prisoners were exposed to the bacterium, often through deliberate infection, or by being housed with already sick inmates. The disease, already rampant in the camps, spread rapidly, causing coughing, weight loss, and slow, suffocating decline. Doctors recorded the progression of symptoms, watching as lungs deteriorated and bodies wasted away. Attempts at treatment were haphazard, with prisoners given experimental drugs or denied treatment entirely. Many were subjected to repeated X-rays, which further weakened their frail bodies. In some cases, lungs were surgically removed in crude procedures that killed more than they saved. Autopsies followed, dissecting organs ravaged by disease. The cruelty lay not only in the infections, but in the indifference to suffering, as prisoners were left to choke in their own blood. Tuberculosis, already a death sentence in the camps, was turned into a deliberate instrument of torment. Other diseases were also tested with ruthless efficiency. Prisoners at Sachsenhausen were exposed to hepatitis, their livers swelling painfully as doctors charted the course of jaundice. At Dachau, diphtheria and scarlet fever were introduced into inmates, the symptoms recorded without intervention. At Ravensbrück, women were injected with pus from infected wounds to test the spread of gangrene and tetanus. Some prisoners were deliberately wounded, then exposed to bacteria to simulate battlefield injuries. Doctors applied ointments, powders, or experimental drugs, noting whether the wounds healed or festered. The results were rarely cures, but prolonged suffering for those already condemned. Victims endured high fevers, organ failure, and septic shock, all while guards ensured they could not resist. Even diseases like smallpox were considered, though large-scale trials were avoided due to the risk of uncontrolled spread. The camps became a grotesque catalogue of illnesses, inflicted at will upon populations with no voice. Each infection was another step in transforming medicine into cruelty. The experiments were conducted with an utter disregard for consent or humanity. Prisoners were not asked if they wished to participate, nor were they told what was being done to them. Needles pierced their veins without explanation. Mosquitoes bit them as they lay restrained. Bacteria was injected while guards held them down. When they asked questions, they were told nothing. When they resisted, they were beaten into compliance. Their bodies were treated as vessels, their pain irrelevant to the data being sought. In medical records, they became numbers, their individuality erased. Survivors remembered the terror of waiting, knowing infection was coming, knowing their strength could not resist it. For many, the uncertainty was as cruel as the disease itself, not knowing whether they would be treated, reinfected, or left to die. In these barracks, medicine was stripped of any semblance of care. It became a system of violation, theft, and betrayal. The mortality rates from infectious disease experiments were staggering. At Buchenwald, where typhus was tested, hundreds of prisoners perished in each trial, their bodies piling up in the camp morgue. At Dachau, malaria studies claimed hundreds more, while tuberculosis spread unchecked among those deliberately infected. Death was not considered failure, but part of the process. Each body one more data point in a macabre ledger. For survivors, survival was often accidental, a matter of chance rather than resilience. Some carried scars for life, their health broken by infections that never fully healed. Others endured chronic fevers, coughing, and weakness long after liberation. The doctors filed their reports, presenting the deaths as outcomes, not tragedies. The Reich accepted the findings, eager for anything that might serve its war effort, but in reality the knowledge gained was negligible, outweighed by the suffering it inflicted. The true outcome was not scientific progress, but devastation measured in human lives. The infectious disease experiments exemplify the total perversion of medicine under the Nazis. They took natural enemies of humanity, typhus, malaria, tuberculosis, and weaponized them against those already imprisoned and dehumanized. Vaccines and treatments were tested without consent, producing mountains of corpses and little reliable knowledge. The language of science concealed the reality of torture, dressing cruelty in clinical terms. For the prisoners, every cough or fever was a potential death sentence, whether inflicted by nature or by design. Their bodies became unwilling battlegrounds in a war they never chose to fight. The experiments demonstrated not innovation but the extremes of ideology, ambition, and indifference. Today their legacy is not measured in discoveries but in testimonies of survivors and the silence of the dead. The infectious disease trials remind us that medicine without ethics is worse than ignorance. It is cruelty cloaked in the guise of care, and it leaves only scars in its wake. Among the most grotesque of Nazi medical crimes were the so-called surgical experiments, where the tools of healing, scalpels, saws, and sutures were turned into instruments of torment. At camps like Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz, prisoners were operated on not to cure, but to test, mutilate, and observe. Amputations were carried out without anesthesia, leaving victims writhing in agony as their limbs were severed. Bone grafts were attempted with crude methods, transplanting tissue from one victim to another, often resulting in horrific infections. Wounds were deliberately inflicted with knives or firearms, then deliberately infected with bacteria, dirt, or splinters to simulate battlefield injuries. Doctors justified this as trauma research, claiming it would help German soldiers. In truth, the procedures were chaotic, cruel, and devoid of real scientific value. The operating tables became torture racks, and the white coats of surgeons concealed the hands of executioners. Medicine's sacred promise was not merely broken, it was inverted. These were not surgeries of salvation, but mutilations masquerading as science. Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp, became infamous for such surgical atrocities. Female prisoners, many of them young Polish resistance fighters, were lined up and selected for experiments described euphemistically as special treatments. Their legs were cut open, muscles slashed, and bones broken deliberately to create wounds. Into these injuries, doctors introduced dirt, bacteria, glass shards, or even cloth fibers, ensuring infection. The women screamed as pus filled their wounds, fevers raged, and the smell of rotting flesh filled the barracks. Some endured repeated surgeries. Their bodies opened again and again under filthy conditions. Amputations often followed, not as treatment, but as further experiments. Those who survived were crippled, left hobbling on crutches or crawling on the ground, marked permanently as rabbits, the camp nickname for these tortured women. Many did not survive at all, succumbing to infection, blood loss, or exhaustion. Ravensbrück's surgical experiments revealed not the triumph of medicine, but its absolute betrayal. Bone transplantation experiments pushed cruelty to new extremes. Doctors sought to remove bones from one prisoner and graft them onto another, a procedure that even under proper medical conditions would have been fraught with risk. At Ravensbrück, women were strapped down as surgeons cut away pieces of bone, muscle, and nerve tissue. These tissues were then implanted into other victims, often without sterilization or proper surgical technique. The results were catastrophic: infected grafts, systemic sepsis, and deaths within days. Survivors were left disfigured, their limbs weakened, their mobility permanently destroyed. The justification was framed as orthopedic research for injured German soldiers, but the data collected was scientifically worthless. The victims were not rehabilitated, they were discarded once their usefulness ended. The camp became a grotesque laboratory of failed grafts and shattered bodies. Each attempt at transplantation was another layer of agony, building a legacy of suffering disguised as surgical progress. Amputations became routine within these so-called studies. Limbs were severed without anesthesia or with only minimal sedation, the pain overwhelming and the wounds rarely treated properly afterward. Some prisoners lost arms, others legs, and many died from shock, blood loss, or infection. Those who survived were sometimes fitted with crude prosthetics, not to aid them, but to test devices for injured German soldiers. The experiments reduced human beings to mannequins for military rehabilitation trials. Others were forced to undergo multiple amputations, each surgery performed not to save but to destroy. The amputated limbs themselves were often dissected or used for further study, treating human bodies as disposable supplies. In some cases, amputations were paired with other procedures, combining mutilation with deliberate infections. The victims had no chance to recover, no care to ease their suffering. They were crippled deliberately, turned into broken shells of humanity. Amputation became both method and punishment, a surgical execution carried out in slow motion. Deliberate breaking of bones was another feature of these experiments, justified as studies in healing fractures under battlefield conditions. Prisoners' legs were fractured with hammers or pressure devices, their pain ignored as bones snapped and splintered. The broken limbs were then set improperly, rebroken, or infected deliberately with bacteria. Some were immobilized in casts, others left untreated to monitor natural healing. The agony was compounded by starvation, exhaustion, and filth, which made recovery nearly impossible. Many victims developed gangrene, their limbs blackening as tissue died, spreading toxins through their bloodstream. Amputations often followed, with doctors dissecting the remains to study infection. Survivors were left permanently crippled, hobbling on twisted legs, or unable to walk at all. For the perpetrators, these experiments were framed as orthopedic advances. For the prisoners, they were acts of cruelty that shattered bones, bodies, and hope. The surgical procedures were often presented as trauma research, supposedly to help German soldiers wounded in battle. Doctors argued that by simulating injuries in the camps, they could discover better ways to treat fractures, infections, and amputations on the front lines. In practice, the experiments bore no resemblance to legitimate medical study. Conditions were uncontrolled, records inconsistent, and treatments grotesquely unethical. The goal was not knowledge but conformity, to prove loyalty to the Reich by producing results at any human cost. The surgeons were not healers but executioners wielding scalpels. Their patients were prisoners who had no voice, no consent, and no hope of survival. Trauma was not alleviated but created, inflicted deliberately on bodies already weakened by starvation and abuse. The experiments revealed nothing of value for medicine, but much about the capacity for cruelty. Trauma became a pretext, a mask for mutilation. Behind it lay ambition, ideology, and absolute indifference to suffering. Survivors of surgical experiments carried scars that were both physical and psychological. Women from Ravensbrück who lived became known as the rabbits, their twisted legs and disfigured bodies silent testimonies to the crimes committed against them. Many could never walk properly again, enduring chronic pain, infections, and disability. The humiliation of being crippled deliberately haunted them for life, stripping them of dignity and independence. Those who lost limbs struggled with prosthetics that never replaced what had been stolen. Beyond the physical scars lay deep emotional wounds, the trauma of hearing the screams of others, the despair of awaiting the next procedure, the grief of seeing friends die on operating tables. Some survivors bore witness after the war, recounting their suffering in testimonies that shook courtrooms and audiences. Their words gave voice to those who could not speak. They transformed personal scars into historical truth. Their courage ensured that the mutilations carried out in secrecy would never remain hidden. The surgical experiments and mutilations stand as some of the most blatant perversions of medicine in history. Amputations, grafts, and deliberate infections were not healing practices but calculated assaults on the human body. They revealed the extent to which ideology and ambition could strip doctors of compassion, turning skilled hands into instruments of torment. The justification of trauma research was a lie, masking atrocities with the language of care. The victims were not healed but broken, discarded, and forgotten until survivors forced the world to remember. Today their scars are symbols of resilience, living counterpoints to the false science that tried to erase them. The surgical atrocities at Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and Auschwitz show what happens when medicine serves ideology rather than humanity. They remind us that the line between healing and harming can vanish when conscience is silenced. In every broken bone, every severed limb, lies a warning. It is the warning that science without ethics becomes mutilation, and medicine without morality becomes murder. From the very beginning of the Nazi regime, women were central to its vision of racial purity and population control. For so-called Aryan women, fertility was celebrated, glorified as their highest duty to the Volk, while for Jewish, Roma, and other marginalized women, fertility was seen as a threat to be eradicated. Inside the camps, this ideology translated into horrific medical practices targeting the female body. Gynecological procedures, sterilizations, and invasive experiments became routine, transforming women into unwilling subjects for Nazi science. Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp, became a primary site of such atrocities. Here, thousands of women were subjected to experiments that focused specifically on their reproductive systems. The message was clear. Nazi ideology saw women not as individuals, but as vessels, either to be encouraged to reproduce or to be forcibly denied that capacity. Gender determined their fate in the medical laboratories of the Reich. In the hands of camp doctors, womanhood itself became a battleground of cruelty. It was not just life, but the possibility of life that was targeted. Forced sterilization was one of the most common and devastating procedures inflicted on women in the camps. Doctors like Karl Klarberg used caustic chemicals, injections, and radiation to destroy reproductive organs. Women were forced onto examination tables without consent. Their legs bound as substances were injected directly into the uterus. The pain was excruciating, often accompanied by fever, bleeding, and infection. Some women died within days, their bodies unable to recover from the trauma. Others survived but were left permanently infertile, robbed of their ability to bear children. For many, this loss was as devastating as physical mutilation, a theft not just of their bodies, but of their futures. In Nazi eyes, These women were reduced to numbers in reports, proof of the efficiency of sterilization techniques. In reality, they were victims of calculated cruelty, their womanhood violated in the name of science. Forced sterilization became not only a tool of genocide, but a deeply personal attack on identity. Pregnant women in the camps faced particularly cruel fates. Some were targeted for experiments, subjected to examinations and procedures that ignored both their health and that of their unborn children. Others were forced into sterilization trials, even during pregnancy, risking the lives of both mother and child. Many were murdered outright, deemed unfit to give birth under Nazi racial laws. Those who did deliver were often killed afterward, or their infants were taken away, either executed or subjected to experiments themselves. Pregnant women became doubly vulnerable. As women and as potential mothers of children, the Reich considered undesirable. The camps offered them no sanctuary, no medical care, no recognition of the sanctity of life. Instead, pregnancy was treated as another opportunity for cruelty and exploitation. The deliberate targeting of mothers-to-be underscored the Nazi obsession with controlling reproduction. It was not only individuals who were destroyed, but lineages and futures. In this, the Nazis attacked the very continuity of families and communities. Gynecological experiments extended far beyond sterilization. Women were subjected to crude surgeries meant to study reproductive anatomy, often without anesthesia. Ovaries were removed, fallopian tubes tied, and organs dissected under appalling conditions. In some cases, pregnant women were forced to undergo abortions carried out with brutal instruments, leaving them maimed or dead. Doctors introduced infections deliberately into the reproductive tract, observing how long women could survive. At Ravensbrück, some were subjected to repeated vaginal examinations, invasions of their bodies that stripped them of all dignity. Others were tested with experimental hormones, their cycles disrupted, their bodies turned into test beds for theories about fertility. These procedures were carried out not to heal but to harm, not to learn but to dominate. Gynecology, once a branch of medicine dedicated to women's health, became a weapon of control and cruelty. In the camps, the female body was not sacred, it was a canvas for atrocity. The role of gender in these atrocities cannot be overstated. Women were chosen for experiments not only because they were prisoners, but because their bodies symbolized the capacity for new life. Nazi ideology sought to deny that capacity to those deemed racially impure, making sterilization a form of genocide by prevention. For women, this meant that their suffering was both physical and symbolic, an assault on their identity as potential mothers. The psychological toll was immense, leaving survivors with lifelong trauma, guilt, and grief. Many who survived sterilization described their loss as worse than death, a permanent reminder of the cruelty inflicted upon them. The Nazis weaponized gender itself, turning womanhood into a liability inside the camps. Female prisoners endured horrors tailored specifically to their sex, reinforcing their dehumanization in ways men did not always experience. This focus on reproduction revealed the depth of Nazi obsession with controlling life. For women, it meant their very essence was under attack. Gender became the lens through which cruelty was magnified. At Ravensbrück, the infamous rabbits exemplify this targeted suffering. These young women, primarily Polish political prisoners, were subjected to surgeries that left them crippled for life. Legs were cut open, bones broken, muscles and nerves severed in repeated experiments. Infections were introduced deliberately, and amputations followed, all under the pretense of medical research. The women became known as rabbits because they were treated like laboratory animals, their bodies mutilated at will. Many died from these experiments, but those who survived carried scars both visible and invisible. Their twisted limbs and crutches became symbols of resilience and testimony. After the war, these women spoke out, bringing the hidden crimes of Ravensbrück to light. Their courage ensured that the world could never dismiss their suffering as forgotten. The rabbits embodied the gendered nature of Nazi atrocities, where the female body was exploited with a cruelty unique to its biology. Their story stands as one of the clearest examples of science turned against women. Survivors of these experiments carried not only physical scars, but deep emotional wounds. Infertility, chronic pain, and disfigurement made reintegration into post-war life incredibly difficult. Many women found themselves unable to marry or bear children, their futures stolen along with their health. Shame and silence compounded their trauma, as societies often struggled to acknowledge what they had endured. Others lived with nightmares of surgical tables, needles, and the faces of doctors who betrayed them. Some were haunted by the loss of children, unborn, killed at birth, or taken for experimentation. Their testimonies, when finally spoken, carried the weight of unimaginable suffering. They described in vivid detail the smell of infection, the sound of screams, and the emptiness left by sterilization. These voices gave humanity back to victims whom the Nazis sought to erase. They remind us that the cost of medical crimes is not only in numbers, but in the lifelong anguish of survivors. Their endurance is a testament to resilience in the face of cruelty. The experiments on women reveal the gendered face of Nazi medical atrocities. They show how ideology turned gynecology, obstetrics, and fertility into tools of domination and destruction. Women were sterilized, mutilated, and exploited not because of what they had done, but because of what they could do: bear children. In targeting the womb, the Nazis targeted the future, seeking to erase entire peoples through the denial of reproduction. The abuse of pregnant women and mothers underscored the depths of cruelty, where even life in its most innocent form was extinguished. Gender was not incidental, but central, shaping the nature of medical crimes in the camps. These atrocities left scars that lasted lifetimes, both for survivors and for the communities whose futures were stolen. Modern medicine recognizes them not as science but as crimes, a reminder of what happens when healing becomes subjugated to ideology. The experiments on women remain among the most chilling violations of human dignity in history. They remind us that gender itself was weaponized in the Nazi pursuit of racial purity. Children were the most vulnerable victims of Nazi medical atrocities, their innocence exploited in ways that defy comprehension. In Auschwitz, Dachau, and other camps, Jewish and Roma children were singled out not only for extermination, but for experimentation. Doctors saw them as ideal subjects for vaccine trials, heredity studies, and cruel psychological observations. Unlike adults, children could not resist, could not question, and often did not even understand what was happening to them. Many were separated from their parents on arrival, their cries drowned out by the chaos of the camp. In some cases, twins and siblings were spared execution only to be handed over to men like Joseph Mengele. Their small bodies were treated as data points, their futures erased before they could begin. The barracks that housed them were places of dread, where any day might bring a summons to the experimental block. Childhood, a time of play and discovery, was replaced with fear and pain. In the camps, the youngest became the most tragic victims of medical cruelty. Roma children, in particular, were targeted at Auschwitz, where an entire section of the camp was set aside for families. Known as the Gypsy Camp, it became a site of horrific experiments. Children were injected with unknown substances, their reactions charted with indifference. Some were given vaccines against diseases like typhus or tuberculosis, while others were deliberately infected without protection. Siblings often endured trials together, one given the vaccine and the other left as a control. The results were predictable: fever, seizures, and death, all carefully noted by Nazi physicians. Parents, when allowed to remain, watched helplessly as their children were used as test subjects. Many were forced to nurse sick children, knowing they had been poisoned by science. Death rates were staggering. Entire groups of Roma children wiped out in waves of experiments. For those who survived, the memories of needles, sickness, and loss haunted them for life. The Roma camp became a graveyard of childhood stolen by medical tyranny. Jewish children too faced a grim fate in the experimental barracks. At times they were chosen for vaccine trials, their arms punctured with injections of untested substances. Other times they were starved deliberately in nutritional studies, their growth charted as their bodies wasted away. Weakened by deprivation, they succumbed easily to disease, which was then used as data to confirm Nazi racial theories. Doctors weighed them, measured them, and took endless notes, treating their suffering as a scientific curiosity. In some cases, siblings were separated, one placed in starvation studies while the other was forced into disease experiments. These cruel comparisons stripped children not only of health, but of the comfort of family. Many wasted away in silence, too weak to cry, their eyes hollow with hunger. Survivors recalled the unbearable sight of tiny bodies shriveled by neglect, abandoned in bunks. The camps transformed children into skeletons before they even reached adolescence. Hunger became not an accident, but an experiment, weaponized against the youngest. Psychological experiments added another layer of torment. Children were sometimes subjected to isolation studies, left alone in dark rooms for days to observe the effects of sensory deprivation. Others were intentionally frightened, their reactions to stress and trauma measured by doctors. Some were forced to witness executions or mutilations of their peers, then studied for signs of psychological breakdown. Mengele himself was known to manipulate children with kindness one day and cruelty the next, observing their confusion and despair. This deliberate alternation of comfort and terror broke their spirits, leaving them unable to distinguish safety from threat. Older children were forced to act as assistants, cleaning up after experiments on their younger counterparts. The guilt and horror of this coerced complicity haunted them long after liberation. Psychological trauma compounded the physical suffering, creating scars that no passage of time could heal. Childhood minds, still forming, were shattered in the process. What remained was not just pain but a lifetime of shadows. Josef Mengele's personal cruelty toward children was infamous even among his fellow SS doctors. He was often seen on the selection ramp at Auschwitz, picking out twins and young children with an almost theatrical air. To those chosen, he sometimes presented himself as charming and gentle, handing out sweets or patting their heads. But behind this facade lay unimaginable horror. He subjected twins to endless measurements, blood draws, and injections, often of substances whose nature was never explained. When one child died, he frequently killed the surviving twin to conduct comparative autopsies. Survivors recalled the terror of being led to his laboratory, uncertain whether they would return alive. Mengele's obsessions robbed children not only of health but of hope, their innocence exploited in service of pseudoscience. To him they were not boys and girls, but specimens, pieces of a genetic puzzle. His cruelty encapsulated the corruption of medicine under Nazism, a smiling doctor who was in truth an executioner. One of the most chilling aspects of Mengele's work was his fascination with twins, many of them children. He saw in them a natural laboratory for studying heredity and sought to unravel what he believed were the secrets of genetic superiority. The children were measured endlessly, their bodies photographed, their blood drawn repeatedly until veins collapsed. In some cases, they were subjected to brutal surgeries, organs removed without anesthesia, or twins, stitched together in grotesque attempts to create conjoined siblings. Survivors spoke of injections that caused fevers, rashes, or death, their twin siblings often forced to endure the same in parallel. Those who died were dissected, their organs compared in meticulous autopsies. The survivors were left not only physically damaged, but emotionally scarred, haunted by the loss of their other half. For twins, the bond of siblinghood became a chain that dragged them both into Mengele's laboratory. Childhood, which should have been a sanctuary of play and love, was transformed into a theater of cruelty. Mengele's twin studies became one of the most infamous symbols of Nazi medical crime. Survivors of these experiments carried scars that never healed. Many lived with lifelong illnesses, stunted growth, or infertility caused by the procedures inflicted upon them as children. Others suffered from chronic nightmares, flashbacks, and a pervasive sense of fear that lingered well into adulthood. Some were left completely alone, their families murdered, their siblings killed in experiments, their futures stolen before they began. When they testified after the war, their voices often trembled, reliving the fear of needles, surgeries, and the sight of their friends dying around them. The loss of innocence was total. These children were forced to confront death before they even understood life. Yet those who survived became witnesses, carrying the memory of countless others who could not speak. Their stories forced the world to acknowledge what had been done. They showed that beneath every statistic was a child with a name, a face, and a stolen future. In their voices, history gained truth and humanity. The experiments on children reveal the depths of depravity reached by Nazi medical practices. Vaccines were tested not to heal, but to harm. Starvation was turned into science, and childhood was dismantled for ideology. Roma and Jewish children bore the brunt of these crimes, chosen because their very existence defied Nazi racial fantasies. Mengele's personal cruelty symbolized the corruption of medicine, where even the most innocent became objects of curiosity. The loss extended beyond those who died, reaching into the lives of survivors who carried trauma forever. These crimes against children underscore the necessity of remembering the Holocaust not only as a story of armies and battles, but of the smallest victims. The silence of murdered children echoes louder than any words, a reminder of futures erased. In every testimony, in every scar, their suffering speaks across generations. The experiments on children were not science, but the deliberate destruction of innocence. They remain among the darkest chapters of human history. In the skies above Europe, the Luftwaffe fought desperate battles for supremacy. And with each dogfight came new questions about the limits of the human body. How high could a pilot fly before losing consciousness? What happened during rapid decompression at altitude? And how much oxygen deprivation could the human brain endure? Instead of answering these questions with controlled and ethical research, Nazi doctors turned to Dachau concentration camp, where prisoners could be sacrificed at will. A low-pressure chamber, capable of simulating extreme altitudes, was installed within the camp. Men were forced inside, strapped into chairs, and subjected to conditions meant to replicate the experience of fighter pilots. The chamber became a coffin of airlessness, where lives ended not in battle, but in suffocating silence. The rationale was military necessity, but the method was murder. Each prisoner who entered became an expendable subject in an experiment designed to serve the Reich. Science had been twisted into cruelty, and aviation medicine became a weapon of death. The high-altitude experiments, overseen largely by Dr. Sigmund Rascher, pushed prisoners to the brink of survival. Air pressure was lowered rapidly to simulate altitudes of up to 20,000 meters, far beyond the conditions most aircraft could even reach. Victims convulsed violently, their bodies racked by spasms as oxygen deprivation set in. Some clawed at their restraints, gasping desperately for air that was no longer there. Their lungs sometimes ruptured from the sudden decompression, while their brains swelled from the lack of oxygen. Blood vessels burst in their eyes and skin, leaving faces swollen and bruised. Observers charted every stage of suffering with stopwatches and notebooks, indifferent to the agony unfolding before them. Many prisoners died in the chamber, their final moments marked by terror and suffocation. Others survived temporarily, only to be killed later for autopsies. The chamber was not a laboratory of progress, it was a theater of slow-motion execution. Oxygen deprivation was at the heart of these experiments, and its effects were studied with chilling detachment. Some prisoners were subjected to gradual reductions in oxygen, their cognitive functions tested until they became delirious. Others were forced into rapid decompression scenarios, simulating sudden cabin failures at altitude. Victims lost consciousness within minutes, some slipping into irreversible brain damage before death. Doctors recorded their reactions to memory tests, coordination exercises, and problem-solving tasks, all while their bodies starved for air. These trials revealed little that had not already been observed in aviation medicine outside the camps, but the Nazis continued relentlessly. For them, the abundance of expendable lives made repetition easy. Each subject was one more data point, one more proof of their research. Yet the cost was staggering, measured not in scientific advancement but in corpses stacked outside the chamber. Oxygen, the very breath of life, was withheld deliberately to serve the Reich's obsession with military advantage. Autopsies were integral to these experiments, carried out with cold precision on the bodies of the dead. Victims were dissected immediately after their deaths, their lungs examined for ruptures, their brains for swelling. Organs were removed, weighed, and preserved, stored in jars as evidence of the experiment's supposed value. Reports were typed up, sanitized in medical language that stripped away the violence of their acquisition. In these documents, murder was reduced to data, agony to numbers, and human beings to specimens. Rascher and his colleagues presented these findings to Luftwaffe officials, claiming that the knowledge would save German pilots. Yet the results were deeply flawed: inconsistent methods, uncontrolled variables, and unreliable conclusions. Science had been abandoned in favor of cruelty, and the corpses piled up as proof of failure, not progress. The autopsy tables at Dachau bore witness to the collapse of medical ethics. The true legacy of these dissections was not discovery, but desecration. Each cut deepened the betrayal of medicine's purpose. The Luftwaffe eagerly accepted the reports, desperate for any information that could improve survival rates among their pilots. Himmler himself took an interest, encouraging Russia and promoting the experiments as patriotic contributions to the war effort. Conferences were organized where the findings were presented to military doctors, who often sat in silence, unwilling to challenge the ethics of the research. Some even praised the work, blinded by ideology or ambition. The collaboration between the SS and the Luftwaffe revealed how military institutions could be complicit in atrocity when desperate for results. Ethical boundaries collapsed under the weight of war, replaced by a culture of obedience and cruelty. What might have been dismissed as pseudoscience in peacetime became accepted as innovation under Hitler's Reich. The partnership gave legitimacy to the experiments, reinforcing the illusion that they served a greater purpose. But behind the official endorsements lay nothing but suffering. The Luftwaffe's silence ensured that Dachau's chamber remained a factory of death disguised as research. For the prisoners who survived the chamber, survival often came with permanent damage. Many suffered from chronic headaches, memory loss, or neurological disorders caused by prolonged oxygen deprivation. Some experienced seizures for the rest of their lives, while others could no longer walk or function normally. Survivors recalled the terror of gasping for air, the sensation of lungs collapsing, the ringing in their ears as consciousness slipped away. The psychological scars were equally deep, with nightmares of suffocation haunting them long after liberation. Some were forced to watch fellow prisoners die in the chamber, knowing they would be next. The cruelty of anticipation became its own form of torture, each day a countdown to another round of testing. The survivors carried their scars not only in their bodies but in their memories. Their testimonies gave voice to those who could not return. They revealed that the chamber was not just an experiment, but a prolonged execution ground. Its legacy was not knowledge, but trauma. The high-altitude experiments highlight the perversion of military science under Nazism. They were framed as essential for aviation medicine, yet they produced little that was useful or valid. The data, tainted by unethical methods and inconsistency, was rejected by post-war medicine as worthless. What remained were the stories of prisoners who died suffocating in silence, their lives extinguished for nothing. These deaths illustrate how easily military necessity can be twisted into justification for atrocity. The hunger for advantage in war blinded the Luftwaffe and its doctors to the moral abyss into which they had descended. Instead of protecting their own pilots, they destroyed the lives of others. The chamber at Dachau was not a tool of progress, but a symbol of regression, a return to barbarism under the mask of science. It revealed the cost of ambition unrestrained by ethics. In its walls, the very air was transformed into a weapon. The aviation and high-altitude experiments remain one of the clearest examples of how Nazi medicine collapsed into atrocity. Prisoners were suffocated, dissected, and discarded in pursuit of military data that yielded no real benefit. The Luftwaffe's complicity ensured that the crimes were not isolated acts of cruelty, but systematic, institutionalized violations. The victims were denied not only life but dignity, their deaths reduced to footnotes in reports. Today, these experiments are remembered not as scientific milestones but as moral failures. They remind us that science without ethics becomes indistinguishable from torture. The chambers of Dachau stand as silent memorials, their walls echoing with the gasps of men starved of oxygen. The human cost far outweighed any supposed gain, measured in suffering rather than survival. The legacy of these experiments is not knowledge but warning. They testify to the dangers of military ambition unchecked by conscience, where the pursuit of flight became the machinery of death. The Nazi medical experiments did not occur in isolation, nor were they the work of rogue doctors acting in secret. They were embedded within a broader structure that linked the SS, the Wehrmacht, and the German state. The SS under Heinrich Himmler provided the camps, the prisoners, and the ideological justification. The Wehrmacht, facing practical challenges on the battlefield, supplied the questions that these experiments were meant to answer: survival in freezing water, resilience at high altitude, treatments for wounds and disease. The doctors themselves stood at the crossroads of ideology and military necessity, presenting their work as solutions to Germany's wartime problems. This coordination was not accidental but deliberate, reflecting the totalitarian nature of the Reich. Medicine was militarized, its practitioners becoming soldiers in white coats, armed with scalpels instead of rifles. The line between healer and executioner blurred until it vanished entirely. In this system, suffering was not a byproduct, but a resource. The camps became laboratories of war, their victims fuel for the Reich's ambitions. The SS played the central role in orchestrating the machinery of atrocity. Himmler viewed the concentration camps as more than sites of punishment or extermination. They were also spaces of experimentation and research. He cultivated relationships with doctors who were ambitious, loyal, and willing to abandon ethics for opportunity. Through his personal patronage, men like Sigmund Rascher, Karl Clauberg, and Joseph Mengele gained access to resources, protection, and a steady supply of human subjects. The SS provided the infrastructure, from barracks converted into laboratories to crematoria that disposed of failed experiments. Orders flowed down the chain of command, framed in the language of duty to the Reich. Those who participated knew they were shielded from accountability as long as they served SS goals. The SS uniform became a license to kill, and its officers ensured that experiments aligned with the ideological mission of racial purification. In their eyes, prisoners were not human beings, but expendable material. This dehumanization was the foundation upon which every experiment was built. The Wehrmacht, though often portrayed as separate from Nazi crimes, was deeply entangled in the experiments. Military officials requested studies on hypothermia, high altitude, and infectious diseases, driven by the demands of the Eastern Front and the air war over Europe. Reports from Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen were circulated among Luftwaffe medical officers, who discussed them as if they were legitimate research. The Wehrmacht's need for solutions gave the SS justification to expand its program of experimentation. The camps became military laboratories, their data presented at conferences attended by high-ranking officers. Though some within the Wehrmacht questioned the reliability of the findings, few challenged the ethics of how they were obtained. Silence became complicity, and demand drove supply. The war effort provided the perfect excuse to transform atrocity into necessity. Soldiers at the front line benefited indirectly from knowledge harvested through death in the camps. The Wehrmacht's collaboration revealed the depth of Germany's moral collapse under Nazism. Doctors became the bridge between ideology and military needs, translating Nazi racial fantasies into medical practice. They presented their experiments as both scientific and patriotic, offering data that promised to improve survival rates, combat diseases, and enhance military readiness. Their reports were carefully phrased to emphasize utility, each infection, each mutilation, each death framed as a step toward protecting German soldiers. In reality, much of the research was methodologically flawed, producing little of lasting value, but the illusion of progress was enough to sustain funding and support. Ambitious physicians understood that their careers could advance through complicity, as long as they aligned with both SS and Wehrmacht goals. Science became a currency, traded for prestige within the Reich. Ideology shaped the questions, the military provided the urgency, and the SS supplied the victims. This unholy trinity ensured that the experiments flourished, unchecked and unquestioned. Doctors, once bound by ethics, became architects of suffering. Their white coats concealed allegiance, not to healing, but to the Reich. The blending of ideology and military necessity was most evident in experiments focused on reproduction and racial purity. Sterilization trials and gynecological procedures were justified as ways to control populations in conquered territories. The Wehrmacht saw such measures as tools of occupation, ensuring that undesirable groups could not repopulate lands earmarked for German settlers. Meanwhile, freezing, hypothermia, and survival experiments were framed as efforts to reduce battlefield losses, tying directly to military objectives. Each experiment thus served a dual purpose, advancing the ideological war against racial enemies while meeting the practical needs of the German army. The camps provided the perfect laboratory where ideology and strategy converged. The victims bore the weight of both their suffering justified by visions of a purified future and the immediate needs of the battlefield. In this way, genocide and war effort became indistinguishable. The Reich's pursuit of total victory encompassed not only territory but biology itself. Human lives were expendable in both visions. This coordination was reinforced by bureaucratic networks that masked atrocity behind layers of paperwork. Research proposals were submitted, reviewed and approved by committees within the SS and the military. Reports were typed up, stamped and circulated through official channels, giving the appearance of legitimacy. Conferences were held where findings were presented to audiences of doctors, officers and scientists, who applauded rather than protested. The process resembled normal scientific exchange, but beneath the veneer lay bodies mutilated and discarded. The bureaucracy insulated perpetrators from guilt, transforming mass murder into administrative routine. Each signature, each rubber stamp, became part of the machinery of death. The banality of paperwork disguised the reality of screams echoing in barracks and laboratories. In this way, atrocity became normalized, absorbed into the daily functions of the state. It was not chaos but order that sustained the experiments. The very efficiency of Nazi bureaucracy enabled the systematic blending of medicine, ideology, and war. The role of the SS and military in medical experiments also reveals how professions can be corrupted by power. Doctors who once swore to heal became complicit in torture, protected by uniforms and ideology. Soldiers who claimed to fight honorably turned a blind eye to crimes committed in the name of their survival. The collaboration blurred the lines between civilian and military medicine, between healing and harming. In Nazi Germany, these boundaries collapsed entirely, swallowed by the totalitarian state. The SS demanded loyalty above all, while the Wehrmacht demanded results, and doctors delivered both. Responsibility was diffused across institutions, making accountability difficult after the war. Yet the victims understood clearly who had harmed them. The men in uniforms, the doctors with needles, the officers with notebooks. Their suffering exposed the lie of professional neutrality. There was no separation between medicine and militarism under Nazism. There was only complicity, structured and sustained. The coordination between the SS, the Wehrmacht and Nazi doctors demonstrates how ideology, medicine and military aims became inseparable. Experiments were not isolated crimes but part of a broader system that harnessed science for war and genocide. The camps provided the victims, the SS the ideology, the Wehrmacht the demands, and the doctors the tools. Together they formed a machinery of suffering that stripped human beings of life and dignity in the name of research. The blending of these forces ensured that atrocities were not accidents but policy. Each experiment was a reflection of the Reich's worldview that life could be controlled, manipulated and destroyed to serve the state. Today, this collaboration stands as a warning of how institutions can betray their purpose when captured by ideology. Medicine ceased to heal, the military ceased to protect, and the state ceased to value life. In their convergence, atrocity became normalized. The victims of these experiments remind us of the cost of such corruption, measured in lives erased by the machinery of war. Amid the silence of history, the testimonies of survivors cut through like fragile yet unbreakable voices, bringing humanity back to the numbers. These were men, women, and children who endured the unimaginable, who carried into old age the memories of needles, scalpels, and chambers of torture. Their words remind us that behind every statistic was a person with a name, a family, and a story interrupted by cruelty. Survivors of sterilization experiments spoke of the moment they realized their ability to have children had been stolen forever. Others recalled the icy tanks of Dachau, the burning sensation of frozen limbs, and the suffocating grip of hypoxia in altitude chambers. Some remembered the taste of poisoned air, the sting of mustard gas, or the agony of infected wounds left untreated. The testimonies are not uniform. They vary in detail, intensity, and perspective, but together they form a tapestry of truth. Each voice challenges denial, exposing the depth of Nazi crimes. Each account makes the abstract concrete, the faceless visible. Without these survivors, the world would know only silence. One survivor of Ravensbrück recalled the moment she was chosen for bone and muscle experiments. She was young, in her 20s, and had already endured hunger and forced labor before being led into the medical block. Strapped to a table, she felt the incision tear into her leg, the shock of pain overwhelming in the absence of anesthesia. Days later, she watched her wound ooze with infection, flies swarming over the pus that seeped through the bandages. She and others like her became known as the rabbits, their legs cut, broken, and scarred in grotesque mimicry of laboratory animals. Many died, but some lived, crippled for life, walking testimonies of Nazi cruelty. She later said that what kept her alive was the thought of telling the world, of ensuring the truth could not be buried with her. Her words were steady but heavy, carrying the weight of all those who had not survived. In every scar on her body was a record of atrocity. Her survival was her protest, her voice the echo of the silenced. A Jewish twin survivor from Auschwitz described the paradox of being spared from immediate death, only to be condemned to Mengeler's laboratory. She remembered the selection ramp, where the doctor's elegant uniform and calm demeanor hid the cruelty that would follow. She and her sister were measured daily, their blood drawn until they fainted, their bodies poked and prodded for comparison. At one point she fell ill from mysterious injections and lay in the infirmary, her fever spiking. Mengele stood at her bedside, watching closely, recording her decline with clinical interest. She said she survived only because her sister begged guards to let her stay alive for the sake of science. Her twin, however, suffered long-term damage to her kidneys, a wound that outlived liberation. Years later, she would still wake in the night, haunted by the sound of her sister's labored breathing. Her testimony became a plea for recognition that children had been turned into data points, that innocence itself had been an object of experimentation. From Dachau came the voices of men forced into ice water tanks for hypothermia studies. One recalled the sensation of his body shutting down as he floated in the frigid water, skin turning numb, his mind clouding into darkness. He remembered being pulled out not for comfort but for another test, scalded in boiling water until he screamed. The cycle of freezing and rewarming repeated, his body weakened beyond recovery. He said he survived by retreating inward, imagining himself on a warm beach, refusing to let the SS take his last refuge, his mind. Others died around him, their corpses dragged away while notes were taken. The survivor testified that he lived not through strength but through chance, chosen to endure longer than others. His words conveyed both guilt and grief, knowing survival came at the cost of countless lives. He bore chronic nerve pain for the rest of his life, a reminder of the ice that had once been his cage. His testimony made the cold of Dachau eternal in memory. Testimonies also came from women subjected to sterilization and gynecological experiments. One survivor described the moment she realized she would never have children. A doctor informed her bluntly that her womb had been destroyed by injections. She was a teenager at the time, her life still ahead of her, and the revelation crushed her spirit. She carried the trauma into adulthood, where every absence, a family not formed, children not born, was a reminder of what had been taken. In court she spoke not only of her pain, but of her defiance, that the Nazis had tried to erase her future, but they could not erase her voice. Another woman remembered being experimented upon while pregnant, her child killed during the procedure. The grief remained with her for the rest of her life, a silent wound deeper than any scar. These testimonies reveal how gendered violence was embedded in Nazi medicine. They remind us that cruelty was not random but targeted, designed to erase not just lives but lineages. Each voice was both confession and accusation. Children, too, testified after the war, though their words were often halting, fragmented by age and trauma. One boy remembered the injections at Auschwitz, the searing pain in his arm, and the terror of watching his twin brother die under Mengeles' gaze. A Roma girl recalled being hungry every day, denied food as part of a nutritional study that measured starvation in her growing body. Another survivor spoke of isolation experiments, locked alone in darkness for days, emerging unable to recognize her mother's face. These fragments of memory reveal the raw vulnerability of children, their suffering compounded by confusion and betrayal. Some grew into adulthood haunted by nightmares, reliving the camp every night. Others lived with physical consequences, blindness, organ damage, infertility. The cruelty inflicted upon them was doubly obscene, for it targeted both their present and their future. In their testimonies, the smallest voices carried the greatest weight. They bore witness not just for themselves, but for thousands of silenced children. Their survival was an act of resistance against oblivion. Survivor testimonies also highlight the strategies people used to endure the unendurable. Some clung to faith, whispering prayers even as they lay strapped to operating tables. Others focused on small acts of resistance, refusing to cry out during procedures, determined to deny their captors satisfaction. Bonds of friendship and solidarity gave strength. One woman at Ravensbrück said she survived only because her fellow prisoners shared their rations and tended her wounds in secret. Another survivor from Buchenwald recalled reciting poetry in his mind during fevered hallucinations, clinging to words as lifelines. These strategies did not erase the pain, but they preserved fragments of humanity amid dehumanization. Survival was rarely about strength alone. It was about chance, community, and the refusal to surrender one's identity. The testimonies reveal that endurance itself was a form of defiance. Each memory preserved was a victory against Nazi efforts to erase them. Each voice that lived to speak defied the silence imposed by death. In their survival lay the seeds of remembrance. The lifelong scars of survivors remind us that liberation did not end their suffering. Many lived with chronic illnesses caused by infections, mutilations, or organ damage. Psychological wounds lingered in the form of nightmares, anxiety, and survivor's guilt. Some found themselves unable to build families, their futures stolen by sterilization or trauma. Others struggled with silence, unable to share their experiences for decades, burdened by shame or disbelief from the outside world. Yet when they did speak, their voices carried immense power, cutting through denial and revisionism. They gave testimony in trials, in documentaries, in classrooms, ensuring the crimes would not be forgotten. Their words restored humanity to the nameless, dignity to the degraded, and truth to history. Through them, the silenced victims speak once more. Their testimonies are not only historical evidence, but moral warnings. They ensure that the world can never say it did not know. As Allied troops advanced into Germany in the spring of 1945, they expected resistance, but what they encountered inside the camps was beyond anything they could have imagined. The gates of places like Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen opened not only to reveal starving prisoners, but also the remnants of medical laboratories of horror. Barracks that had once been filled with screams now contained silent rows of corpses, abandoned by retreating SS guards. Surgical tables stood with bloodstains still visible, instruments scattered as if experiments had been interrupted mid-procedure. In storage rooms, Allied soldiers found jars filled with human organs, preserved specimens that testified to the scale of medical crimes. Piles of notebooks and reports, hastily left behind, documented procedures with clinical detachment. The survivors who stumbled forward to greet their liberators were skeletal, their bodies marked by scars from experiments, their eyes hollow from suffering. For many Allied troops, the sight was incomprehensible, a nightmare made real. Liberation was not simply a military victory, it was the unveiling of truth. The world was about to confront the darkest side of medicine. At Dachau, American troops discovered the low-pressure chamber used for aviation experiments, its walls still bearing scratch marks from prisoners who had clawed for air. Nearby, tanks used for hypothermia studies sat filled with water, silent witnesses to hundreds of deaths. In the camp infirmary, medical records meticulously detailed the suffering inflicted on prisoners in the name of science. Soldiers found corpses awaiting autopsy, their bodies dissected and partially preserved. Some still bore signs of the experiments, incisions, amputations, or burns from chemical exposure. The air reeked of decay and disinfectant, a combination that seemed to encapsulate both the pseudo-scientific pretense and the reality of mass murder. Prisoners who could still speak told their rescuers about being frozen, suffocated, poisoned, and mutilated. Many soldiers broke down, unable to reconcile their expectations of a battlefield with the reality of a laboratory of death. Photographs were taken, not out of curiosity, but to prove that such horror truly existed. The camp became both evidence and accusation, a place where medicine had betrayed its oath. At Ravensbrück, Soviet troops uncovered the legacy of the rabbits, the Polish women who had been mutilated in surgical experiments. Survivors showed their twisted legs, their infected scars, their bodies crippled by deliberate cruelty. Some could hardly walk, hobbling forward on makeshift crutches to testify about what had been done. They spoke of bones broken with hammers, of infections deliberately introduced, of amputations carried out with no anesthesia. In storerooms, Soviet soldiers found surgical tools, records, and photographs of the procedures. The women's bravery in revealing their suffering ensured that the crimes would not remain hidden. For the liberators, the discovery was shattering. Medicine, supposedly a profession of healing, had been turned into torture. Ravensbrück became a symbol of gendered medical atrocity, its survivors living testimony to what the Reich had done. Their bodies carried evidence more powerful than any document. Liberation meant exposure, but it also meant that the scars would never fade. In Buchenwald, American troops were horrified to find evidence of typhus experiments, racks of corpses, and storage rooms filled with human remains. Survivors described being injected with deadly bacteria, their deaths observed with indifference. Autopsy rooms contained preserved brains, lungs, and other organs, each labeled with numbers corresponding to experimental logs. Pharmaceutical company representatives had worked with camp doctors here, testing new vaccines and drugs on prisoners. Soldiers were stunned to learn that commercial interests had been complicit in the crimes. Survivors staggered forward, skeletal and barely alive, describing how they had been infected again and again until their bodies broke down. The evidence was overwhelming. Science and industry had colluded in mass murder. Buchenwald was not only a place of death, it was a laboratory, its data written in blood. For the Allies, the discovery was both shocking and undeniable. The truth lay not only in documents, but in the living wrecks of human beings. The camp became a courtroom before any trials began. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops encountered scenes of almost unimaginable devastation. Though not primarily a site of experiments, the camp revealed the medical consequences of neglect, starvation, and disease. Piles of unburied corpses lay in the open, Their emaciated frames a testament to systematic deprivation. Survivors crawled among them too weak to stand, begging for food and water. Doctors among the liberators struggled to provide care, their medical training tested to the limit by the scale of suffering. Typhus raged through the camp, claiming victims even after liberation. British medical staff improvised hospitals, but for many it was too late. Bergen-Belsen illustrated that cruelty did not always require scalpels and syringes. Starvation and neglect could be as deadly as deliberate experiments. For the world, the images broadcast from Belsen revealed the human cost of dehumanization. Liberation here meant both rescue and reckoning. The shock spread beyond the battlefield into the consciousness of civilians. Humanity itself seemed to cry out from the graves of the camp. Allied forces were meticulous in documenting what they found, understanding immediately that denial and disbelief would follow. Photographers captured images of medical laboratories, dissection tables, preserved specimens, and the survivors themselves. Reports were written, cataloguing the experiments in clinical detail. Prisoners gave statements, many still trembling with fever, recounting their ordeals for military investigators. Entire warehouses of documents, charts, and correspondence were seized, providing a paper trail of atrocity. These records would later form the backbone of evidence at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. The Allies knew that without such documentation, the scale of the crimes might one day be questioned. The camera became a weapon of truth, exposing the lies of Nazi propaganda. Each photograph, each testimony, each preserved organ jarred from a shelf became part of a case against those who had called themselves doctors. Liberation was not only about saving lives, it was about preserving evidence. The world had to see, and the world had to know. For the soldiers themselves, liberation was a searing experience that changed them forever. Hardened combat veterans, who had faced artillery and machine guns, broke down in tears at the sight of children mutilated by experiments. Many confessed they could not eat for days after entering the camps, their stomachs turning at the smell of death. Some tried to comfort survivors, giving them chocolate, cigarettes, or blankets, small gestures in the face of immense suffering. Others struggled with rage, wanting to punish the SS guards they captured on the spot. Testimonies from Allied troops reveal that the camps left deeper scars than battles. They had been prepared for war, but not for atrocity. The shock reverberated through entire units, carried back home in letters and stories. Families of soldiers heard first-hand accounts that seemed too horrific to believe. The liberation of the camps did not only reveal the crimes to the world, it marked the liberators themselves with trauma. They became unwilling witnesses to the darkest side of humanity. The liberation and discovery of Nazi medical crimes shook the world to its core. For the first time, the extent of the atrocities became undeniable, captured in photographs, testimonies, and the bodies of survivors. The experiments were no longer rumors or reports. They were visible, tangible, and recorded. The shock was profound, not only for the Allied troops, but for civilians who saw the images published in newspapers and shown in newsreels. Medicine had been transformed into murder, science into sadism, and the evidence lay before the eyes of humanity. The world was forced to confront questions about morality, progress, and the fragility of ethics under totalitarianism. Liberation brought freedom to some, but revealed scars that would never heal for many. The camps became museums of cruelty, their ruins preserved as warnings. The discovery of the experiments ensured they could never be denied. In their exposure, the victims regained their voices, and the silence imposed by the SS was broken forever. When the war ended in 1945, the crimes uncovered in the concentration camps demanded not only condemnation, but justice. Among the most shocking revelations were the medical experiments, where physicians had betrayed their oath to heal and transformed into agents of torture. The Allies, determined to hold perpetrators accountable, organized a series of military tribunals in Nuremberg, Germany. One of the most significant was the Doctors' Trial, formerly known as the United States v. Karl Brandt et al., held between December 1946 and August 1947. 23 defendants stood in the dock, most of them physicians who had held high-ranking positions in the SS, the Wehrmacht, or research institutions. They were accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, and participation in experiments on unwilling subjects. For the first time in history, doctors were placed on trial, not for malpractice, but for atrocities on a global scale. The world watched as medicine itself was placed under scrutiny. The trial symbolized a reckoning not only for individuals, but for the profession as a whole. The lead defendant was Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation. Brandt had overseen the T4 euthanasia program and was deeply implicated in the coordination of medical crimes. Alongside him stood men like Victor Brack, who administered sterilization programs, Herta Oberheiser, one of the few women on trial infamous for her work at Ravensbrück, and Wolfram Sievers, head of the SS's UNERBA research organization. Sigmund Rascher, Mengele, and Klauberg were absent, either dead, missing, or fugitives. Yet the men and women in the dock represented the architecture of Nazi medicine, from camp doctors to policymakers. The courtroom became a gallery of betrayal, where physicians who had once sworn to protect life now faced judgment for orchestrating death. Their demeanor varied, some defiant, some resigned, some attempting to justify their actions as patriotic duty, but the evidence weighed heavily against them. The trial became not only legal proceedings but moral theater, exposing how deeply medicine had been corrupted by ideology and war. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Allied investigators had seized thousands of documents from camps and research institutes, detailed logs of experiments, autopsy reports, and correspondence with SS and Wehrmacht officials. Photographs of mutilated survivors and preserved organs from camp laboratories were displayed in court. Testimonies from liberated prisoners described in chilling detail the injections, operations, and infections they had endured. American prosecutors emphasized that these were not isolated acts, but systematic, coordinated programs. Witness after witness confirmed the deliberate nature of the crimes, recounting how their bodies had been used against their will. The precision of Nazi record-keeping, intended to glorify their achievements, now damned them. Each report, signed by a doctor, became a piece of evidence against its author. The clinical detachment with which death was recorded horrified the judges. In Nuremberg, medical documentation became proof not of science, but of sadism. The courtroom itself became an extension of the morgue, filled with the voices of the dead and the scars of the living. Survivor testimonies were among the most powerful elements of the trial. Women from Ravensbrück recounted how their legs were cut open, bones broken, and wounds deliberately infected. Men from Dachau described being plunged into ice water tanks or suffocated in pressure chambers. Twin survivors from Auschwitz told of Mengele's experiments, though the doctor himself had fled justice. These voices, trembling with both fear and determination, forced the world to listen to what the victims had endured. Their scars, often shown in the courtroom, spoke louder than words. The judges and spectators alike were confronted with living evidence of crimes that had once been hidden. Survivors gave dignity back to the countless others who had died without a chance to speak. Their testimonies were acts of resistance, ensuring that the perpetrators could not hide behind paperwork and euphemisms. In Nuremberg, the silenced were heard at last. Their words became pillars of justice in a world struggling to comprehend atrocity. The defense attempted to justify the experiments in various ways, but their arguments crumbled under scrutiny. Some claimed they had acted under orders and had no choice but to comply. Others insisted their work had scientific or military value, portraying themselves as patriots serving Germany. A few argued that medical experimentation had been common in history, and that they were unfairly singled out for practices done elsewhere. But the judges rejected these excuses, pointing out the absolute lack of consent, the sadistic cruelty, and the staggering death tolls involved. The claim of following orders was deemed no defense against crimes against humanity. The court emphasized that individual responsibility could not be erased by obedience. In the end, the defenses revealed the moral bankruptcy of the perpetrators, who sought to hide behind technicalities while their victims bore lifelong scars. Their justifications failed to mask the reality. They had chosen ambition and ideology over ethics and humanity. The trial laid bare the emptiness of their excuses. The verdicts were delivered in August 1947, bringing closure to one of the most important trials of the 20th century. 7 defendants, including Karl Brandt and Victor Brack, were sentenced to death and later executed. Others received long prison sentences, ranging from life to a few years, depending on the extent of their crimes. A handful were acquitted, though their reputations were forever tarnished. The executions were carried out at Landsberg prison, marking the end for men and women who had wielded scalpels as weapons of genocide. Justice, though imperfect, had been served. For survivors, the sentences brought some sense of recognition, even if no punishment could balance the suffering endured. The doctor's trial made it clear that medicine was not immune from accountability. It established that doctors could be judged not only as professionals but as criminals. The courtroom at Nuremberg became a place where the corrupted heart of Nazi science was finally condemned. It was a reckoning written in law and in history. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the doctor's trial was the creation of the Nuremberg Code, a landmark in medical ethics. In response to the atrocities revealed, the judges outlined 10 principles that defined legitimate human experimentation. Central to the code was the idea of voluntary consent, declaring that no experiment could be justified without the informed agreement of the subject. It also emphasized the necessity of minimizing suffering, ensuring scientific validity, and allowing subjects to withdraw at any time. These principles were revolutionary, setting boundaries for research that had never been codified so explicitly. The Nuremberg Code became a foundation for modern bioethics, influencing laws and medical standards worldwide. Though initially resisted by some researchers, its moral authority grew with time. The blood of the victims gave weight to its words, ensuring they would not be forgotten. Every modern consent form echoes Nuremberg. Every ethical guideline bears the imprint of the trial. The code was the victim's legacy, written into the conscience of medicine. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg was more than a trial of individuals. It was a trial of a profession, a nation, and a civilization's values. It forced the world to confront how healers had become executioners, how science had been twisted into cruelty. It revealed that progress without ethics leads not to discovery, but to destruction. The evidence and testimonies shocked humanity into creating safeguards to ensure such crimes could never be repeated. The Nuremberg Code stood as both judgment and promise, a vow to remember the victims by protecting future generations. Yet the trial also served as a warning. The capacity for evil lies not only in ideology, but in institutions and individuals who surrender conscience to power. The courtroom at Nuremberg was filled not only with defendants but with ghosts, the dead whose voices echoed through every testimony. Their suffering became law, their silence transformed into principles. In condemning the doctors, the world sought to redeem medicine itself. Justice was imperfect, but it was essential. In the years after the doctor's trial, a haunting question lingered in scientific circles. Could any knowledge be salvaged from the wreckage of Nazi medical crimes? The experiments had produced mountains of data, meticulously recorded by physicians who believed they were contributing to research. Hypothermia studies at Dachau, altitude tests in decompression chambers, and infection trials in Buchenwald all generated charts, graphs, and autopsy reports. Some military officials, desperate for insights into survival at sea or in flight, wondered if these results could be useful. Others argued that to use such data was to legitimize the atrocities that produced it. The debate raged in academic journals, conferences, and classified government reports. At its core was a question that science had never confronted so directly: can knowledge born of cruelty ever be clean? For some, practicality outweighed morality. For others, morality outweighed utility. In the shadow of Nazi science, medicine faced an ethical crossroads unlike any it had seen before. The hypothermia experiments became a focal point of this debate. In Dachau, prisoners had been frozen in icy tanks, their suffering charted with clinical detail as they died. After the war, American researchers studying hypothermia in aviation and naval medicine examined the Nazi data. Some argued it was worthless, pointing out the sloppy methodology, the lack of controls, and the inconsistent results. Others claimed it might contain insights into human endurance under extreme cold, insights that could save lives. The ethical dilemma was clear: to cite the data risked honoring the crimes, but to ignore it meant discarding potential knowledge paid for in blood. Military and civilian researchers grappled with the paradox. Ultimately, most rejected the Nazi findings as scientifically unreliable, concluding that cruelty had produced not clarity, but chaos. The experiments revealed more about sadism than survival. In this rejection lay both a moral and scientific verdict. The data was tainted, and so too was its value. A similar dilemma surrounded the Luftwaffe's high-altitude experiments. Rascher and his colleagues had documented the effects of rapid decompression, oxygen deprivation, and suffocation at simulated altitudes. Their reports contained detailed charts of physiological collapse, often ending with death. Some post-war aviation researchers considered whether these notes could help in designing safer pressurized cabins. But the findings were inconsistent, riddled with contradictions, and devoid of rigorous controls. Victims were of varying health, ages, and conditions, making comparisons unreliable. Moreover, the very circumstances of their deaths, conducted under terror, starvation, and exhaustion, rendered the results meaningless for healthy pilots. Scientists who reviewed the data concluded it had no practical application. More importantly, they recognized that using it would legitimize atrocities disguised as research. The chamber at Dachau was not a laboratory of progress, but of execution. Its legacy was not science, but evidence in a courtroom. The data was discarded, and its cruelty condemned. Pharmaceutical companies also found themselves in the shadow of Nazi science. Firms like Bayer and IG Farben had profited from experiments in camps, testing new drugs and vaccines on unwilling prisoners. After the war, questions arose: could these drugs, some of which showed effects, be used in peacetime medicine? Could research built on human suffering continue as part of pharmaceutical development? The answer, for many, was morally unambiguous: such knowledge was irredeemable. Yet traces of these collaborations haunted the industry, raising questions about profit, complicity, and responsibility. Post-war medicine had to decide whether to integrate or reject results obtained by coercion. In most cases, Nazi pharmaceutical discoveries were dismissed as unreliable, their methods too flawed to be trusted. But the memory of industry's role in atrocity remained, a stain that shaped ethical debates for decades. Nazi science cast not only a moral shadow but a corporate one. It forced entire industries to confront their role in atrocity. The question was not only about data, but about conscience. The ethical debate extended into philosophy and law. Scholars asked whether citing Nazi research in academic papers was itself a form of complicity. Was it possible to extract knowledge from horror without honoring the perpetrators? Some argued that if lives could be saved by using the data, then the victims' suffering might at least yield a grim legacy of benefit. Others countered that such reasoning reduced victims to instruments, repeating the very dehumanization that had defined the camps. The Nuremberg Code had already established the principle of consent, making it impossible to justify experiments without it. To use Nazi data risked undermining the very foundation of that code. It blurred the line between justice and exploitation. The debate revealed that science is not morally neutral. It is shaped by the conditions of its creation. Knowledge carries the weight of its origins. In the case of Nazi science, that weight was unbearable. The shadows stretched into every field of medicine. Survivors themselves often spoke against the use of Nazi data. For them, the experiments were not abstract studies, but personal scars, etched into their bodies and memories. They insisted that to use the results was to dishonor the dead, to turn their suffering into footnotes in medical journals. Many survivors demanded that the experiments be remembered only as crimes, never as contributions to science. Their voices carried moral authority that statistics could not match. They had lived through the needles, the infections, the mutilations. To them, any suggestion of utility was another violation, a theft of dignity from those who had perished. Survivors called for remembrance, not reuse. Their testimony shifted the debate away from cold pragmatism toward empathy. In honoring their wishes, medicine reclaimed its humanity. Their rejection of Nazi science was not only emotional, but profoundly ethical. It reminded the world that knowledge without morality is not knowledge at all. It is cruelty disguised in numbers. Ultimately, the consensus that emerged was one of rejection. Scientists, ethicists, and legal scholars concluded that Nazi medical experiments were not only immoral, but scientifically invalid. The data was riddled with inconsistencies, produced without control, and tainted by the conditions of terror. Even when fragments appeared potentially useful, their origins rendered them unfit for legitimate research. Modern medicine turned its back on Nazi science, choosing to build anew on foundations of consent, transparency, and humanity. The Nuremberg Code ensured that no future researcher could claim ignorance of these principles. The legacy of the experiments became a negative one. They taught medicine what never to do. Their contribution was not data, but warning, not discovery, but restraint. In rejecting them, the world reaffirmed that science must serve humanity, not destroy it. The shadow of Nazi science became a reminder of the abyss that awaits when ethics are abandoned. Its rejection was itself a form of healing. The shadow of Nazi science still lingers today, a dark reminder of medicine's capacity for betrayal. Every modern debate about research ethics, informed consent, or vulnerable populations echoes the lessons of Nuremberg. The data produced in the camps lies largely untouched, preserved not for use but for condemnation. It remains in archives as evidence, not as guidance, a permanent warning of what science becomes when divorced from morality. The ethical questions posed by these atrocities continue to resonate in universities, laboratories, and hospitals worldwide. They force each new generation of physicians and scientists to confront the weight of history. The rejection of Nazi pseudoscience was not only a decision about the past but a promise for the future. It was a vow never to cross the line between study and sadism again. In the end, Nazi experiments contributed nothing to medicine but everything to ethics. Their true legacy lies not in knowledge gained but in the lessons learned. The crimes of Nazi doctors did not end with the war. Their legacy has continued to shape medicine, ethics, and memory for decades. From the ashes of the concentration camps, a new awareness emerged about the dangers of science divorced from morality. The revelations of the doctor's trial and the Nuremberg Code forced physicians and researchers around the world to confront questions they had never considered so urgently. Consent, dignity, and the rights of human subjects became central pillars of modern bioethics. Every medical school, every research institution now carries the weight of those lessons. The atrocities of the camps made clear that progress without principles is peril, not discovery. The memory of the victims serves as a permanent reminder of the cost of ignoring ethics. Their suffering transformed medicine, not through the data produced by cruelty, but through the rules created in response. In this way, the dead shaped the future. Their loss became the foundation of protection for all who came after. Museums and memorials across the world now preserve the evidence of Nazi medical crimes. At Auschwitz, visitors can see the remnants of laboratories where twins were measured, cut, and killed. At Dachau, the pressure chamber still stands, its walls silent witnesses to suffocation and despair. Ravensbrück displays the stories of the rabbits, young women whose twisted legs became symbols of both cruelty and resilience. Photographs, documents, and testimonies are curated to ensure that the crimes remain visible, undeniable, and unforgettable. Memorials in Germany, Poland, Israel, and beyond honor the memory of victims, turning sites of horror into places of reflection. Museums do not present these exhibits as curiosities, but as warnings, demanding that visitors confront humanity's darkest potential. Each preserved instrument, each scarred survivor's testimony, is a rebuke to indifference. Memory itself becomes a form of justice, a way to resist the erasure of atrocity. The stones, walls, and exhibits speak on behalf of the silenced. In their preservation, history continues to speak. Survivors themselves became living memorials, dedicating their lives to ensuring that what they endured would not be forgotten. Many spoke in schools, universities, and public forums, their trembling voices carrying truths more powerful than any textbook. Others published memoirs, capturing in words the pain and resilience of their journeys. Some testified in courts and trials, pointing directly at those who had once wielded scalpels over their bodies. Their advocacy ensured that denial could not take root unchecked. They demanded recognition not only of the crimes but of the humanity of the victims. By speaking, they reclaimed agency stolen from them in the camps. Their voices were often filled with pain, but also with determination to protect future generations. Survivor advocacy became the moral compass of remembrance. Through their courage, history remained alive. Their words continue to echo long after their passing, forming an unbroken chain of memory. The lessons of Nazi medical crimes became embedded in international law and medical practice. The Nuremberg Code influenced later declarations such as the Helsinki Declaration and the Belmont Report, which further defined the rights of research subjects. Informed consent became a universal principle, shaping clinical trials, medical research, and patient care. Institutional review boards and ethics committees were created to oversee studies, ensuring that no experiment could proceed without careful scrutiny. These structures were born directly from the horrors revealed at Nuremberg. In hospitals and laboratories today, every consent form signed by a patient is part of that legacy. The crimes of the past gave shape to protections in the present. The victims, though denied their own rights, secured rights for those who came after, their suffering became law, their pain transformed into prevention. Medicine, scarred by betrayal, sought redemption through ethics. The memory of atrocity reshaped the conscience of science. Yet the legacy of Nazi medical crimes is not only about ethics, but about vigilance. The atrocities showed how easily science could be corrupted when it served ideology and power. They revealed that doctors, trained to heal, could become executioners if they surrendered their conscience to the state. The lesson is that medicine is never neutral. It always reflects the values of the society it serves. In times of crisis, whether war or epidemic, the temptation to cut ethical corners can resurface. The shadow of Nazi science warns against complacency, reminding us that humanity's progress depends on constant moral awareness. Vigilance means remembering not only what happened but why it happened. It means teaching future doctors that their responsibility is to humanity, not ideology. The legacy of the camps is thus both a memory and a mandate. It demands eternal watchfulness, lest history repeat itself. Never again is not a slogan, but a duty. Education plays a central role in carrying this legacy forward. Universities and medical schools integrate Holocaust studies into their curricula, reminding students of the dangers of ethical collapse. Courses in bioethics often begin with the story of Nuremberg, grounding abstract principles in the reality of atrocity. Museums and traveling exhibitions bring these lessons to the public, ensuring that awareness extends beyond the medical profession. Documentaries, films, and literature amplify the voices of survivors, spreading their testimony across generations. This educational mission is itself a form of memorialization. It ensures that the crimes remain present in collective memory, not buried in dusty archives. Knowledge becomes a tool of prevention, arming societies against the resurgence of cruelty. By teaching, the world honors the dead. By remembering, it safeguards the living. Education ensures that the legacy of atrocity becomes the foundation of ethics, not its abandonment. The victims themselves remain at the heart of this legacy. Each name, each face, each story adds weight to the vow of remembrance. They were not numbers in logbooks or specimens on autopsy tables. They were mothers, fathers, children, and friends. Their dignity was stripped away in life, but it is restored in memory. Memorials, testimonies, and ceremonies give back the humanity that was denied in the camps. To remember them is to affirm their worth, to declare that their suffering was not in vain. Every candle lit at a memorial service, every stone placed at a grave, every moment of silence reaffirms their presence in history. They are not forgotten shadows but eternal reminders. Their legacy is not only in ethics and law, but in the act of remembrance itself. By keeping their memory alive, humanity resists the erasure of atrocity. Memory becomes an act of justice, and remembrance an act of resistance. The legacy of Nazi medical crimes is one of both horror and hope. Horror, because they revealed the depths to which medicine can sink when stripped of morality. Hope, because their exposure led to a revolution in medical ethics that continues to protect lives today. Museums, memorials, and survivor voices keep the memory alive, ensuring that the world does not look away. The Nuremberg Code and its descendants safeguard the dignity of every patient and subject, a silent promise written in every ethical review. The victim's suffering has become humanity's conscience, their memory a warning etched into law and practice. To forget them would be to risk repetition. To remember them is to honor their lives and to uphold the vow of never again. Their legacy endures in every ethical safeguard, in every lesson taught, in every silence held in their memory. The shadow of atrocity gave rise to the light of accountability. In that light, Their voices still speak